Somewhere across the top of Africa, under a sky so dry that the stars do not twitch, there lies a stretch of land so wide that the maps have to shrink everything else to fit it in. It runs from one ocean to a sea on the far side of a continent, more than 3,000 miles of it, and from the shore of the Mediterranean down to the dry grass of the Sahel. And it is so large that a person could set out at walking pace and spend the better part of a year getting from one edge of it to the other. Most of the time, nothing at all happens there. The wind moves a little sand from one side of a ridge to the other side of the same ridge. A shadow crosses a stone plateau and then uncrosses it. Somewhere a grain of quartz that has been traveling for 11,000 years arrives at a dune crest, sits for a moment, and slides down the far face with several million others in a soft, dry hiss that sounds, if you are close enough, almost like a voice. And then the sun goes down, and the heat that has been standing on the sand all day lifts straight up into a cloudless sky and simply leaves. And by the small hours, the same ground that could have scorched a bare hand at noon is cold enough to hold frost. Picture it as it is at this exact moment, because it is happening now, whatever time it happens to be where you are. A pale plain with no lights on it at all for 100 miles in any direction. A line of dunes standing in starlight with their crests faintly luminous and their shadowed faces going down into a soft dark that is not quite black. No wind, no water anywhere, no sound of any kind except a very faint granular ticking as the surface of the sand cools and settles grain by grain over an area the size of a country. Nothing waiting to happen, nothing needing to be decided. This is a collection of 100 quiet facts about that desert. They are gathered slowly and told slowly, and nothing at all is required of the listener except the willingness to drift. There is no story here that must be followed, no thread to keep hold of, no names that will be tested later, and no ending waiting at the far side to reward anyone who stays awake for it. Each fact stands on its own, the way a stone stands on its own on a gravel plain, and if attention wanders off somewhere between one fact and the next, nothing is lost at all, because the desert carried on exactly as it was, whether anyone was listening or not. That is the whole appeal of the place, in a way. It is entirely indifferent, and there is a great deal of comfort in that. If you enjoy these long, quiet nights, a like or a subscribe helps more than you would think, but only if you genuinely enjoy what happens here, and never otherwise. And if you feel like it before you drift off, leave your town and your local time down in the comments, because it helps other people who cannot sleep find their way to this quiet corner and know that somebody else is awake with them. Now settle into whatever stillness you have managed to arrange. Let the lamp go down if there is a lamp. Let the shoulders drop one slow inch, and then another, and let the day that is finished be finished. There is nothing left in it that needs carrying. Whatever was not done today will still be available tomorrow, and will very likely turn out to have been smaller than it looked. Let the jaw unclench. Let the hands go loose. Let the breath out a little further than usual, and then let it come back on its own without being asked, and then let it go again and stop supervising it after that. The voice will stay level for the next several hours. The pace will stay slow. Nothing in it will rise, and nothing in it will surprise. If it becomes indistinct, that is exactly right. If it becomes a sound rather than a set of words, that is better still. The facts will move outward in an order that is meant to be easy to fall through rather than easy to follow. They begin with the scale of the place, which is difficult to hold, and then go down to the sand itself, which is easy. Then, back through the strange green centuries, when this desert was a country of lakes and cattle and rivers, and down into the water that still lies sleeping beneath it, and up into the cold, clear night sky above it. Then, out among the small, tough lives that manage there, and along the flight paths of the birds that cross it in the dark, and out on the wind that carries a piece of it across an entire ocean every summer. Then along the old salt roads with their camels and their 40-day silences, past the libraries and the salt towns and the tunnels dug by hand through solid rock. And then, at the very end, back to the dunes at 3 in the morning, where the whole thing settles and cools and goes quiet again. By then, if the end is ever reached, the listener will very probably be asleep, which was always the intention. So the counting can begin now, out on the widest part of it, where the sand has no interest in anything and the horizon takes all day to change. The first fact concerns the size of the thing, because nothing else about the Sahara makes much sense until the size has been allowed to sink in. It covers something close to 3.5 million square miles, which is a number that refuses to be pictured, so it is usually handed over in comparisons instead. It is about the size of the whole of the United States. It is about the size of China. Laid over Europe, it would swallow every country from Portugal to the Ural Mountains and still have sand left over for the sea. It stretches across 11 countries, depending on where you decide the edges are, and the edges are genuinely arguable, which is part of the point. Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Sudan, Chad, Niger, Mali, Mauritania, and the long disputed coastal strip of the Western Sahara all hold a share of it. From the Atlantic surf on its western shoulder to the Red Sea on its eastern one is something over 3,000 miles of continuous dryness. From the Mediterranean beaches in the north to the thorn scrub of the Sahel in the south is around 1,000 miles more. And within all of that, there is no river that crosses it and survives except one. And that one is the Nile, which does not so much belong to the desert as pass through it holding its breath. Everything else that starts as water in the Sahara ends as vapor or ends underground, and the desert absorbs it without comment, the way it absorbs everything else. The second fact is that the Sahara is not the largest desert on Earth, although it is very nearly always described as though it were. A desert is defined by dryness rather than by heat, by how little falls from the sky rather than by how hot the sand gets, and by that measure the two great polar deserts at the top and bottom of the world are both larger. What the Sahara is, without any argument at all, is the largest hot desert on the planet, and by a very wide margin. The next contenders, the Arabian and the Australian interior, are enormous places in their own right and would each fit inside the Sahara several times over with room to spare. The distinction matters less than the feeling behind it. There is no other place on earth where a person can travel for a week in a straight line at the speed of a loaded camel and arrive somewhere that looks, sounds, smells, and feels precisely like the place they left, with the same wind, the same color, the same silence, and the same total absence of any reason to stop. That uninterrupted sameness, more than the temperature, is what makes the Sahara feel like a different order of thing from other dry places. The third fact is about the edges, and it is stranger than it first sounds. The Sahara does not have a fixed boundary. It has a breathing one. Along the southern rim, where the desert meets the Sahel, The line where the last thorn trees give out and the sand takes over moves north and south by tens of miles from one decade to another following the rains. In a run of good years, the grass creeps out into ground that was bare. Herders push their animals further north than their fathers ever risked, and small seasonal ponds appear in hollows that had been dust for a generation. In a run of dry years, the whole line retreats again, and the sand walks quietly back over everything. Satellite records covering the last 100 years suggest the desert as a whole has grown by something like a tenth. Mostly along that southern edge and mostly in the dry season, but the record also shows the edge pulsing in and out every single year like something slowly breathing. It is not a wall, it is a tide made of dryness, and it goes in and out on a rhythm measured in seasons and decades rather than hours. The fourth fact tends to disappoint people at first and then to fascinate them, which is that most of the Sahara is not sand. The picture everyone carries, the endless, smooth apricot dunes running to the horizon in soft curves, describes only about a fifth to a quarter of the surface. The rest is stone. Vast, flat plateaus of bare rock, scoured clean by wind, called hamada, where the surface is cracked slabs and boulders, and nothing softer has been allowed to stay. Immense plains of gravel called reg or Sahara, where the fine material has all been blown away over thousands of years, and what remains is a single close-packed layer of pebbles, polished, wind-varnished, and locked together so tightly that a vehicle can drive across it for 100 miles as though it were a road. There are salt flats, dry lake beds, mountain ranges, canyons, and long empty valleys full of nothing at all. The sand seas, the true dunes, are magnificent, but they are the exception. They sit in the low places, in the basins, in the sinks, where the wind eventually gives up and puts down what it has been carrying, and everywhere else the desert is hard, dark, and swept. The fifth fact concerns those sand seas which have a proper name of their own. An erg is a sea of dunes, and the Sahara holds some of the largest on the planet. The Grand Erg Oriental and the Grand Erg Occidental in Algeria are each about the size of a small country. The Libyan Sand Sea, which spills across the border into western Egypt, runs for hundreds of miles in long parallel ridges so regular that from high above they look combed. Erg Chech, Erg Iguidi, the Erg of Bilma, the Erg of Mursuk, each one a distinct body of sand with its own grain color, its own dune shapes, its own prevailing wind. In some of them the sand lies more than 500 feet deep, filling and smoothing over an older landscape of hills and valleys that is still down there, buried exactly as it was, holding riverbeds and lake floors that have not seen the sky in thousands of years. Crossing an erg is not like crossing open desert. It is closer to crossing a mountain range that has been made soft, where every ridge must be climbed and every crest descended, and where nothing stays put long enough to be mapped in any final way. The sixth fact is that the Sahara has mountains, and some of them are volcanoes. The Ahagar Massif in southern Algeria rises out of the middle of the desert in a wilderness of black volcanic plugs and spires, the eroded throats of ancient volcanoes standing up like broken teeth, with the town of Tamanrasset at its foot. Further east in northern Chad, the Tibesti Range is bigger and wilder still, crowned by Emi Kusi, a shield volcano that reaches more than 11,000 feet above the sea and carries a caldera on its top some 12 miles across. The Tibesti holds hot springs, sulfur fields, and craters so large and so regular that geologists studying Mars use them as a comparison. Because these highlands stand so far above the plains, they catch what little moisture crosses, and their upper slopes are measurably cooler and greener than anything around them, holding relict plants left over from a wetter age. Snow has fallen on the high Tibesti. Frost is ordinary up there in winter, in the middle of the largest hot desert on Earth. There are places where a person needs a coat. The seventh fact goes the other way, downward to the lowest ground. In the northwest of Egypt lies the Qattara Depression, a great sunken basin of salt marsh, crusted flats, and quicksand that drops to something like 430 feet below the level of the sea. It is one of the lowest points on the whole African continent. And it is enormous, roughly the size of a small nation, a slow, eroded hollow gouged out over ages by wind stripping away salt-weakened rock and carrying the pieces off grain by grain. Its floor is treacherous, a crust of dried salt over wet mud that will not hold weight, and during the Second World War, it formed the southern anchor of the desert front precisely because armies could not cross it. Engineers have proposed for a century that a canal could be cut from the Mediterranean to let seawater fall into the basin and generate power as it dropped, filling an inland sea over decades. Nothing has ever come of it. The depression simply sits there, silent, salt white, well below the waves that are only a short distance away on the other side of a low ridge. The eighth fact concerns the desert pavement, which is one of the most quietly ingenious surfaces in nature. On the gravel plains, the stones lie in a single, tight layer, sitting shoulder to shoulder like a cobbled street laid by nobody. Underneath them is fine, soft dust. The explanation is slow and satisfying. Over thousands of years, wind lifts away every particle small enough to lift, and each time the ground swells with a rare wetting and shrinks again as it dries. The larger stones work gradually upward through the fines beneath them until they meet at the surface and lock together into an armored skin. Once that skin is complete, the dust below is sealed in and the erosion stops. The stones themselves acquire a dark glossy coating over the ages, a thin varnish of manganese and iron laid down at a rate measured in microns per millennium, which turns pale rock the color of old bronze. A single scuffed footprint in desert pavement can remain visible for decades because there is no process out there in any hurry to repair it. Tank tracks from the desert campaigns of the 1940s are still legible on some of those plains today. The ninth fact is about how the Sahara sits inside the machinery of the whole planet, and why it had to be somewhere. The great deserts of the world lie in two neat belts, one to the north and one to the south of the equator, and they are there because of the way air circulates. Hot, wet air rises at the equator, dumps its rain as it climbs and cools, then travels away at high altitude toward the poles, and around 30 degrees of latitude on either side, it sinks back down. Sinking air warms as it descends, and warm air holds its moisture rather than releasing it, so under those two belts of descending air, almost nothing falls. That is the reason the Sahara exists, and it is the same reason for the Arabian, the Kalahari, and the Australian deserts. The Sahara is simply the largest expression of a permanent feature of the atmosphere, sitting under a lid of dry, sinking air that has been quietly refusing to rain on it for a very long time. It is not an accident or a wound. It is the weather system working exactly as it always has. The 10th fact is about how long it takes to cross, which is the only measurement that ever really meant anything to the people who lived with it. On foot with loaded camels, the classic north to south crossings took between 40 and 60 days, and that was with the route known, the wells known, and the season chosen. The margins were not generous. A well that had been fouled or had gone dry could turn a routine journey into a disaster within 2 days, and the distances between water on some legs were long enough that the animals were watered to bursting and then not watered again for a week or more. Travel happened at night and in the early morning across the worst stretches, and the middle of the day was spent lying still in whatever shade could be improvised, because moving in the afternoon heat cost more water than it gained ground. Modern vehicles have compressed those 40 days into 3 or 4, and aircraft have compressed them into hours, but the underlying arithmetic has not changed at all. The desert is still exactly as wide as it ever was, and the water is still exactly where it always was, and every one of those old routes ran from one drink to the next with nothing in between. So that is the shape of the place, more or less, and there is no need to hold on to any of it. The numbers are only there to give the mind something soft to lean against. 3.5 million square miles is not a quantity anybody can actually picture, and it does not matter in the least whether it is remembered, because the desert would be exactly that wide whether the figure had ever been written down or not. What is worth keeping, if anything is the feeling underneath the numbers, which is of a distance that does not resolve. You look toward the horizon, and the horizon is a straight line. You walk toward it for 4 hours, and the line is still straight and still the same distance away, and the only thing that has changed is that the sun has moved, and the shadows have shortened, and the ridge you set off from has sunk very slightly behind you. That is the entire experience of scale out there, repeated for 1,000 miles. Now the attention can come down a little closer to the ground, because everything that follows is smaller. Having stood back far enough to see a desert the size of a continent, the next 10 facts go all the way in the other direction, down to the individual grain and the wind that pushes it, and to the shapes that a very simple rule makes when it is repeated a few trillion times without supervision. Let the breathing go a little slower for that. There is no urgency in what comes next, and nothing in it will be needed later. Somewhere out there, right now, in the actual dark on the actual sand, a slope that has been building all afternoon has just reached the angle at which it can no longer hold itself together, and a thin sheet of grains a few inches deep is sliding down the face of a dune with a soft, dry sound like sugar being poured. And it will stop in a moment and settle, and the slope will begin quietly rebuilding itself, and nobody at all is there to see it happen. That is the subject of the next 10 facts: the sand, and how it arranges itself, and what the wind has been doing with it for the last several thousand years while everybody has been busy with other things. It is worth knowing, before any of that begins, that not one grain of it was placed. There is no arrangement out there that anybody made, and no shape that anybody intended. The whole enormous sculpture of it, every ridge and crest and long parallel corridor running for 40 miles, assembled itself out of one very simple relationship between moving air and loose particles, repeated an unimaginable number of times over an unimaginable stretch of years, with no plan and no supervision and no outcome in mind. That is a restful thing to know at this hour, because it means there is nothing out there to be got right. A dune cannot fail. A ripple cannot be behind schedule. The sand has no standards and holds nobody to any. And it has been producing some of the most beautiful landforms on the surface of this planet continuously for millions of years, purely as a side effect of not being able to help it. Let that be the frame for the next 10. Nothing coming up was designed, nothing coming up is finished, and nothing coming up requires anybody's approval, including the listeners, who is welcome to stop listening at any point. The 11th fact is that dunes come in a small number of shapes, and once the shapes are known, the whole sand sea starts to read like handwriting. Where the wind blows steadily from one direction and there is not quite enough sand to go around, it builds barchans, the crescent dunes, each one a low curved wall with two horns trailing downwind, gentle on the windward slope and steep on the sheltered side. Where there is plenty of sand and the wind comes from two directions that argue with each other across the seasons, it builds long, straight sift dunes, sword dunes, running for miles in parallel ridges with smooth lanes of gravel between them, so regular that a traveler can follow the corridors between them like streets. Where the wind comes from 3 or more directions over the course of a year and never settles the matter, it piles up star dunes, great pyramids of sand, with arms radiating out from a central peak, which do not travel at all, because every wind that pushes them one way is answered by another wind pushing them back. There are dome dunes with no slip face, reversing dunes that swap their steep side twice a year, and enormous compound draws, dunes built of smaller dunes riding on their backs. None of it is random. Each shape is a record of the winds that made it, written in a medium that can be read by anyone who learns the alphabet, and a person standing on a ridge in the middle of an erg is standing inside a diagram of the last several thousand years of local weather. The 12th fact is that some of those dunes are astonishingly old and astonishingly still. Star dunes in particular, because every wind that shifts them is canceled by another, can occupy the same patch of ground for tens of thousands of years, growing slowly upward instead of traveling. Researchers coring into one such dune in Morocco found that the sand at its base had last seen daylight around 13,000 years ago, and that the great bulk of the structure above it had assembled itself over the last 1,000 years, meaning the thing had sat there through the entire span of recorded human history, gaining height, doing nothing else. Some of the largest star dunes in the Sahara stand more than 1,000 feet from base to crest, taller than most buildings anyone has ever built, made entirely of loose grains that could be scooped up in a hand. Climbing one takes hours, because for every 2 steps upward, the sand gives back 1, and the summit ridge, when it is finally reached, is often no wider than a footpath, with a knife-edge crest that a person can straddle with a leg down each side and feel the whole enormous mass of it perfectly balanced beneath them. The 13th fact is one of the strangest sounds in the natural world. Certain dunes boom. When a large enough sheet of dry, well-sorted, rounded sand avalanches down a slip face, the grains do not simply slide, they begin to move together, and the whole layer starts to vibrate at a single, low frequency, producing a deep, sustained note that can carry for miles. Travelers have reported it for centuries and generally described it as drums, or distant aircraft, or a low organ, or a voice, and it was widely attributed to spirits before anyone measured it. The note is usually somewhere around the bottom of a bass singer's range, and it can last for several minutes and reach a volume that makes conversation difficult. Not every dune can do it. The sand has to be dry, the grains have to be within a narrow range of sizes and well polished, and the slope has to be steep enough to fail all at once. Only a few dozen booming dunes are known on the planet, and several of the finest are in the Sahara. It is entirely possible to sit at the foot of one, push a shoulder into the slope above, and cause the whole hillside to hum. The 14th fact is that dunes travel, and that they travel slowly enough to be lived with and fast enough to be a problem. A modest Bartian in a steady wind moves downwind by something between 10 and 100 feet in a year. And it does so by the simplest possible mechanism, which is that grains are picked up from the gentle windward slope, carried over the crest, and dropped in the still air behind, so the dune is constantly dismantling its front and rebuilding its back, arriving somewhere new without a single grain having made the whole journey. Whole villages have been abandoned to advancing sand. Roads across parts of the Sahara have to be cleared like snow, with graders working a permanent circuit. Palm groves on the desert margins are protected by fences of dried palm fronds set in grids across the sand upwind, which break the wind near the ground and make it drop its load short of the trees, a technique that is centuries old and still works better than most modern alternatives. And because the dune passes through rather than stopping, the ground it leaves behind on the far side emerges again in its old shape, sometimes with the ruins of whatever it buried still standing there, patiently waiting. The 15th fact concerns a single grain of sand and where it has been. Most Saharan sand is quartz, which is the leftover of continents. The mineral that is too hard and too chemically stubborn to break down into anything else, so it accumulates as everything softer around it dissolves and washes away. A grain in a great erg may have started as part of a granite mountain hundreds of miles away and hundreds of millions of years ago, been carried by ancient rivers, dropped in a delta, buried, cemented into sandstone, lifted, weathered out again, and set loose to be blown about. Desert grains are visibly different from beach grains under a lens. Sea sand is rounded but glassy because water cushions the collisions. Wind-blown sand is rounded and frosted, matte and pitted, because in air the grains strike each other at full speed with nothing in between, chipping tiny craters into one another millions of times over. That frosted surface is why dunes look soft rather than sparkling, and why the Sahara in flat light has the color and texture of powdered apricot rather than the glitter of a beach. The 16th fact is that the desert's winds have names, and that people who lived under them treated them as personalities rather than as weather. The Harmattan blows out of the northeast across West Africa in the winter months, dry as paper, carrying a permanent haze of fine dust that dims the sun to a pale disk, cracks lips and furniture, and drops the humidity so low that wooden doors shrink in their frames. The Sirocco lifts Saharan air north across the Mediterranean, arriving in southern Europe hot, gritty, and enervating. And there are old laws and older excuses in several countries that treat behavior during a Sirocco with a certain leniency. In Egypt, the Khamsin blows in spring, named for the roughly 50 days over which it is expected. And it can raise the temperature by dozens of degrees in a few hours and fill the sky with orange. In Libya, it is the Ghibli. In Morocco, it is the Chergi. They are all the same air doing the same thing, which is moving off an enormous hot, dry surface toward somewhere cooler, but each culture along the rim named its own arrival, because when it comes, it changes everything about a day. The 17th fact explains the color. Pure quartz sand is a pale, slightly translucent gray-white, and there are Saharan dunes that are nearly that color, so bright in the sun that they hurt to look at. But most of the sand is not white. It is honey, apricot, rose, or a deep rusty orange, and the reason is a film of iron oxide only a fraction of a micron thick. Laid down grain by grain over enormous spans of time as trace iron in the sand is slowly weathered and redeposited on the surfaces. The older the sand and the longer it has been sitting in the same place getting wetted and dried, the redder it becomes. This means a dune field's color is roughly a measure of its age, and it also means that the deeper layers, dug into with a hand, are often startlingly paler than the surface, so that a scoop taken out of a red dune reveals a pale interior, like fruit under a skin. At dawn and at dusk, when the light itself is red, the effect compounds, and the whole erg goes the color of a coal fire for about 20 minutes and then quietly cools back to gray. The 18th fact is about what lies underneath the sand seas, which is a whole other country. The sand is a blanket, not a foundation. Beneath the great ergs, ground-penetrating radar carried on aircraft and satellites has traced valleys, hills, escarpments, and above all riverbeds, wide meandering channels with tributaries and floodplains and terraces, all of them dry, all of them buried under anything from 10 to 500 feet of loose sand. In some places, the buried topography is dramatic enough that if the sand were somehow lifted away in a single afternoon, the country revealed would look like green farmland in Spain with the water taken out. The sand simply flowed into the low ground and filled it the way water would, and then stopped, leaving the higher rocky ground poking through as the dark ridges and plateaus that break up every sand sea. Every erg, in other words, is a lake of sand lying in a basin, and the shape of the basin is still down there under it, unchanged, holding the outline of a wetter world. The 19th fact is that dune fields organize themselves at several scales at once, which is why they look so oddly deliberate. Walk on a dune, and the surface under the feet is covered in ripples, small regular corrugations a few inches apart, formed within minutes by grains bouncing along and knocking others forward in a rhythm. Step back and those ripples are riding on the flank of a dune 50 or 100 feet high, which took years to build. Step back further from an aircraft, and the dunes themselves are riding on far larger ridges, spaced a mile or two apart, which took thousands of years. Each scale is made of the one below it and knows nothing about the one above it, and no one designed any of it. It emerges, the way frost patterns emerge on a window, from a very simple rule about grains and wind repeated an unimaginable number of times. There is something restful in that, standing on a dune at dusk with ripples running away in perfect parallel lines toward a crest a quarter-mile off. Nothing out there is trying. It is all just the arithmetic of sand, working itself out slowly for as long as there is wind. The 20th fact is about how quickly the surface of the desert changes and how slowly the desert does. A single windy afternoon can rearrange every ripple in an erg, erase a set of tracks, move a crest by a few feet, and leave the place looking, to an inexperienced eye, entirely different from the morning. And yet the same dune field, photographed from orbit at intervals of decades, is recognizably the same object, with the same great ridges in the same relative positions, the same corridors between them, the same dark islands of rock. The pattern is stable even though every particle in it is in motion, which is a fair description of a river as well, and possibly of most things. Travelers who worked the old routes navigated by exactly this. They did not navigate by individual dunes which lie, but by the corridors between the ridges, by the dark rock outcrops, and by the stars, all of which stay where they are put. The sand may be restless, but the sand sea itself is one of the more patient objects on the surface of the world. Let that settle for a moment. Ripples riding on dunes, riding on ridges, wind writing the same sentence over and over in a language with about 4 letters in it, and nothing out there aware that any of it is happening. It is one of the more restful things to think about in the dark because it is entirely finished business. Whatever the sand does tonight, it has already done a great many times, and it will do again. And no outcome is pending. There is nothing to worry about on a dune, which is possibly why people who have spent time out there talk about it the way they do. Now the next stretch goes backwards. Everything so far has described the desert as it is, and the desert as it is turns out to be a fairly recent arrangement, more recent than pottery, more recent than the first towns, and considerably more recent than a great many people would guess. If the whole of the last 12,000 years were laid out end to end, the sand would only occupy the last half of it, and the first half would be a country of lakes and grass and rivers with cattle on it and people painting pictures of the cattle on the rock walls. That is not a theory assembled out of nothing. It is written in lake sediments, in pollen, in fish bones lying in dry sand, in harpoon points, in the shorelines of a vanished inland sea that can still be traced from the air, and in 15,000 images painted and carved onto cliffs by people who were simply recording what was standing in front of them at the time. So for the next stretch, the picture of endless sand can be set gently aside and replaced with something greener and considerably noisier. Hippopotamus in the shallows, fish in quantity, herds of cattle being moved between grazing, rivers that ran the whole way to the Atlantic. It was all there, on the ground that is now the driest place many people can name. Within a span of time that human beings were present for and paid attention to and left a record of. Let the eyes stay closed for this part. It is easier to see with them shut. It helps, for this part, to notice how short 5,000 years actually is, because the mind tends to file anything before its own great-grandparents in the same undifferentiated bin marked long ago. 5,000 years is roughly the distance between now and the first pyramids. It is 150 or so generations of people, which is a number a person could count to in an afternoon. And within that span, the entire middle of a continent went from grassland with lakes on it to the driest large place on earth, and human beings watched it happen and painted what they saw, and eventually packed up and moved to the river valleys where there was still water. It was not a catastrophe in the sense of a single bad afternoon. It was slow enough that no individual person would have registered it as an event, and fast enough that a family could have known that the pond their grandmother described was not there anymore. That is the strangest scale of change there is, the kind that is invisible inside a life and obvious across 4 of them. The rock walls of the Tassili hold the whole of it, in ochre, in order. The 21st fact is the one that reorganizes everything else, which is that the Sahara was green, and not very long ago, for roughly 6,000 years. Beginning around 11,000 years back and ending around 5,000 years back, the region that is now the largest hot desert on Earth was a landscape of grassland and open woodland, threaded with permanent rivers and studded with lakes. Pollen taken from sediment cores shows grasses, sedges, acacia, and in the wetter corners, even the kinds of trees that need a genuine wet season every year. Bones taken from the same layers include hippopotamus, elephant, giraffe, buffalo, antelope, crocodile, and enormous quantities of fish. Human settlements were scattered across ground that no one could live on today without a truck full of water. It was not a jungle, and it was not lush in the way a rainforest is lush, but it was ordinary, habitable country, of the sort that people and herds move through without thinking about it, and it covered the entire width of North Africa. This period has a name, the African Humid Period, and the shift that ended it is one of the largest and best documented environmental changes of the whole human story. The 22nd fact explains why it happened, and it is a matter of the Earth's posture rather than anything on the surface. The planet wobbles slowly on its axis, and the point in its orbit at which the northern hemisphere leans closest to the sun drifts around the calendar over a cycle of roughly 23,000 years. When northern summers receive more sunlight, the land heats more strongly, and the great West African monsoon, which is essentially a sea breeze on a continental scale, is drawn much further north than it reaches today. Rain that now stops at the Sahara is pulled 1,000 miles up into the middle of the desert, year after year, century after century, and the country greens. When the wobble carries northern summers back toward weaker sunlight, the monsoon retreats south again, and the country dries. This has happened over and over. The Sahara has swung between green and gold dozens of times, on a clock of about 20,000 years for the last several million years. What is unusual is not that it is a desert now. What is unusual is that human beings happened to be present with cattle and pottery and paintbrushes during the most recent green phase and left a record of it. The 23rd fact is about a lake that is not there anymore. Lake Chad today is a modest, shallow, shrinking body of water on the desert's southern edge. During the Green Sahara, it was one of the largest lakes on the planet, so much larger that it is given a different name, Lake Mega Chad. And at its greatest extent, it covered something like 130,000 square miles, which is bigger than the whole surface of the Caspian Sea and larger than all 5 of the North American Great Lakes put together. Its old shorelines can still be traced across the desert from the air as faint, pale beach ridges hundreds of miles from any water, running level for enormous distances the way only a shoreline can. When it overflowed, it spilled through a channel to the southwest and drained toward the Atlantic. When the monsoon finally withdrew, it did not dry out gradually and gently. Sediment cores suggest that at times the level fell fast and that great areas of former lake floor were exposed to the wind within a few centuries, which matters enormously, because that exposed lake floor is the source of an astonishing amount of what happens later in this list. The 24th fact is that the people of the Green Sahara painted, and that their galleries are still on the rock. In the Tassili Asia, a maze of eroded sandstone pinnacles in southeastern Algeria, there are something like 15,000 engravings and paintings spread across the cliffs and shelters, spanning thousands of years. The oldest show wild animals, elephant and rhinoceros and giraffe, and hunters with bows. Later layers show cattle in enormous herds, painted with the care of people who counted them daily, along with the huts and the milking and the movements of a full pastoral society. Later still, the cattle disappear from the paintings and horses take over, drawing light chariots. And last of all come the camels, which is the desert announcing itself. That sequence of animals painted on the same rock walls is a straightforward record of a landscape drying out, told by the people who watched it happen, and simply painted what was in front of them. In one place in the far southwest of Egypt, a shelter that has become known as the Cave of the Swimmers holds small ochre figures with their arms and legs extended, apparently floating, in the middle of one of the driest places now known on the face of the earth. The 25th fact is that the rivers of the Green Sahara are still there, as shapes. Radar can see through several yards of dry sand, and satellites carrying radar have mapped a whole hidden drainage network across the western desert, including one enormous system, sometimes called the Tamanrasset River, which appears to have run from the Ahagar Highlands more than 500 miles west to the Atlantic coast of Mauritania. Where it met the ocean there is a vast submarine canyon carved into the continental shelf, the sort of feature that only a very large river can cut, and it sits precisely where the buried channel arrives at the coast. If the river were flowing today, it would rank among the dozen largest on the continent. Elsewhere, buried channels lead directly to the sites where stone tools and fish bones and grinding stones are found in quantity, which is exactly what would be expected, because people lived on rivers then as they do now. The desert is not a blank. It is a drowned country with the water removed, and a map of it is still legible if you use the right eyes. The 26th fact is that a few of the Green Sahara's animals never left. In scattered pockets of the Ennedi Plateau in Chad and in isolated pools in Mauritania, there are crocodiles, not visitors, not escapees, but small relict populations that have been marooned in permanent rock pools since the rivers around them dried, hundreds of miles from the nearest crocodile in any direction. They are small, they are few, and they survive by lying up in caves and crevices through the worst of the dry season in a torpid state, waiting for the pools to fill again. Local people have known about them for as long as anyone has asked, and in several places they were regarded as sacred and left strictly alone, which is very likely why they are still there. There are similar stranded survivors among the fish and among certain plants growing high on the cooler slopes of the Tibesti and the Ahagar, species with their nearest relatives in the Mediterranean left behind on mountain islands when the Sea of Green retreated. Every one of them is a piece of the old world holding on in a shrinking room. The 27th fact is about a graveyard in the sand. In the Tianur region of Niger, in a place now so dry and so empty that it is often called the desert within the desert, a team searching for dinosaur bones stumbled instead on human burials and eventually uncovered a cemetery holding some 200 graves used across two separate populations thousands of years apart, both of them during the Green Period. The earlier group were tall, hunted and fished the shore of a lake that once lapped nearby, and were buried with harpoon points and the bones of large fish and turtles. The later group was smaller, herded cattle, and buried their dead in different postures with different goods. One grave in particular, found intact, held a woman and two young people arranged facing one another with their arms interlinked and their hands clasped, laid on a bed of flowers whose pollen was still in the soil beneath them. That grave was cut into the shore of a lake that no longer exists, in a place that now receives essentially no rain, and it is about 5,000 years old, which puts it right at the moment the water was going away. The 28th fact is that the Sahara is far older than the Green Period, and older than most people assume. Marine sediments drilled off the West African coast contain dust blown from the continent, and the record of that dust shows that a genuinely arid North Africa has existed in some form and with interruptions for something like 7 million years, and possibly longer. That is older than our own species by a wide margin. It is older than the first stone tools. What the green periods represent are not the desert's exceptions, but its regular breathing. The wet half of a cycle that has been running since long before anybody was around to be inconvenienced by it. Set against that, the 5,000 years of the present dry phase are a short chapter. The desert has been in this state for the entire span of pyramids, alphabets, empires, and cities, which feels permanent from where we stand, and is, from the desert's own point of view, roughly a quarter of a wobble. The 29th fact is that the Sahara is one of the finest fossil grounds on the planet. For the simplest of reasons, which is that nothing grows on it to hide the bones. In the Kem beds along the Moroccan and Algerian border, in beds of red sandstone that were once a huge river delta, weathering has exposed the remains of an astonishing predator fauna from around 100 million years ago, including the enormous sail-backed Spinosaurus, an animal that appears to have spent much of its life in water and whose bones are dense, like the bones of a hippopotamus. For exactly that reason, in Niger, whole herds of long-necked plant-eaters have been quarried out of the sand. And in the Fayum in Egypt, in a dry basin called the Valley of the Whales, there are dozens of skeletons of early whales lying on the desert floor, animals with recognizable hind legs from the period when whales were still in the middle of leaving the land, scattered across dunes several hundred feet above the present sea. The 30th fact follows directly from that, which is that the Sahara has been ocean. For long stretches of geological time, a shallow warm sea covered much of North Africa, and the limestone laid down on its floor is the rock that the whole eastern desert is built from. That limestone is made almost entirely of the shells of small marine organisms, and in the plateaus around Cairo, it is packed with coin-shaped fossils called nummulites, some of them the size of a fingernail, others larger. Those blocks were the building stone of ancient Egypt. The casing and core of the great pyramids at Giza are cut from a seabed, and anyone who has ever put a hand flat against one of those blocks has laid a palm on a compressed layer of creatures that lived and died in warm salt water tens of millions of years before there was a desert, let alone anybody to be impressed by it. The desert, in other words, is not just dry land that lost its water. It is a former ocean floor, lifted, drained, baked, and blown about, and it has been many other things besides. There is a thought that tends to arrive at about this point, and it is worth handing over slowly, because it is the hinge that the whole of the next stretch turns on. If all of that water was really there, in lakes the size of small seas and rivers running for 500 miles, then where did it go? Some of it evaporated, which is the obvious answer and the least interesting one. But a great deal of it did not go up at all. It went down. It soaked into porous sandstone, worked its way slowly through the pore spaces at the pace of a few feet in a year, and kept going, and it is still down there now, hundreds and sometimes thousands of feet beneath the sand, filling the gaps between grains of rock in quantities that are difficult to state without sounding foolish. The desert did not lose its water. It filed it. And every oasis, every hand-dug tunnel, every well on every caravan route, and every circular green field visible from orbit in the middle of nowhere is a place where somebody found a way to reach back down and take a little of it out again. That is what the next stretch is about. It is the part of the desert that is most easily forgotten, because it is invisible, and because standing on the surface of a sand sea in the middle of the afternoon gives absolutely no hint of it. But it is there, in the dark, in the rock, motionless, cool, tens of thousands of years old. And the entire human history of this desert has been organized around the small number of places where it comes within reach of a rope and a bucket. So the attention can go downward for a while, out of the sun, under the sand, into the cold, quiet layers where the rain of the last ice age is still sitting exactly where it stopped. It is one of the more comfortable places the mind can go at this hour, and the breathing can go down there with it. Consider what a well actually is in a place like that, because the word is far too small for the object. It is a shaft, often hand-cut, sometimes lined with acacia wood or with stone, going down through rock and sand for anything from 30 feet to several hundred. Dug by people using hand tools and baskets, frequently over a period of years, at a location chosen on the basis of accumulated knowledge that could not be written down. It required an enormous investment from a community that had very little to invest, and once it existed, it was the single most valuable object for 100 miles, more valuable than any building, and it was maintained, defended, inherited, argued over, and remembered in detail by people who had never seen it, because knowing where the next one was is what made travel possible at all. Every dot on an old caravan map is one of those. Somebody dug it. Somebody kept it clean. Somebody's great-grandchildren still drink from it. The whole human geography of the Sahara is a network of holes in the ground, connected by an oral database of distances, and the fact that it worked for 1,000 years is quietly remarkable. The 31st fact is that there is an enormous quantity of water underneath the Sahara, and that almost none of it is being replaced. Beneath eastern Libya, southern Egypt, northern Sudan, and northeastern Chad lies the Nubian sandstone aquifer system, a layer of porous rock saturated with fresh water across an area of about 800,000 square miles. The volume held in it is estimated at something on the order of 150,000 cubic kilometers, which makes it the largest known body of fossil groundwater on the planet, and which is roughly comparable to the volume of one of the larger freshwater lakes on Earth, only spread thin through sandstone and lying up to several thousand feet down. There are other great aquifers, too, under Algeria and Tunisia, under Mauritania, under the Chad Basin. Stand anywhere on the northern Sahara, and there is, on average, a colossal amount of drinkable water directly beneath your feet, quietly filling the porous spaces between grains of an ancient sandstone, going nowhere and doing nothing at all. The 32nd fact is how old that water is, and it is the sort of fact that changes how a glass of it feels. Isotopy dating of Nubian aquifer water gives ages of tens of thousands of years, with much of it falling between 20,000 and 40,000 years old, and some samples considerably older than that. It is rain from the green periods and from the ice ages before them. Rain that fell on grassland when there were mammoths on other continents, which soaked in, worked its way down through the sandstone at the pace of a few feet per year, and has been sitting there ever since. In most of the desert, essentially, nothing is being added, because, essentially, nothing falls, which means that pumping it is not farming, it is mining. The wells that irrigate the great circular green fields visible from orbit in the middle of the Libyan and Egyptian deserts are drawing down a reserve that took 100,000 years of a different climate to fill, and which will not be refilled under present conditions on any timescale. That means anything to a person. It is a strange thing to grow wheat with. The 33rd fact is about oases, and about how much less magical and how much more interesting they are than the picture suggests. An oasis is not a puddle that happens to survive. It is a place where the geology brings that deep water within reach, either because the rock layers fold upward or because the ground surface has been eroded down into a basin far enough to intersect the water table, or because a fault allows pressurized water to rise on its own. Siwa, in the far west of Egypt, sits in a depression below sea level with hundreds of springs and a pair of salt lakes. Bahariya, Farafra, Dakhla, and Karga string out along a chain of depressions in the western desert like beads. Some of these places have been continuously inhabited for thousands of years, and their populations were historically limited not by land, of which there was plenty, but by water, of which there was a precisely known and jealously administered amount. Every date palm in an oasis is in effect an entry in a very old ledger. The 34th fact is one of the great quiet engineering achievements of the human species. In the Tuat and Gurara regions of southern Algeria and in similar form across Iran, Oman, and western China, people solved the evaporation problem by refusing to let the water see the sky. They dug a mother well up on higher ground until it struck the water table, then dug a tunnel from it, sloping very gently downhill toward the settlement, sometimes for miles, with vertical shafts sunk at intervals along the route to remove spoil and admit air. Water then ran to the village by gravity alone, underground, cool and unevaporated, arriving in the open only where it was needed. These systems are called fogaras in the Algerian Sahara. Some are more than 1,000 years old and still flowing. When the water finally emerges, it is divided by a stone or plaster comb with slots of carefully different widths, each slot allocated to a family, so that the share is fixed by the physical width of a notch rather than by anyone's word, and those measurements were maintained and adjudicated over centuries. There is something deeply admirable about a technology whose entire purpose is patience. The 35th fact is the industrial version of the same idea. In the second half of the 20th century, Libya, having gone looking for oil in its southern desert and found water instead, began one of the largest civil engineering projects ever attempted, laying thousands of miles of concrete pipe, each section wide enough to drive a truck through, to carry fossil water from well fields deep in the Sahara north to the coastal cities where nearly everyone lives. It moves millions of cubic meters a day. The pipes were cast at dedicated factories built for the purpose, hauled on specially made transporters, and buried across country that had never carried infrastructure of any kind. Whatever one thinks of the arithmetic behind it, standing beside one of those pipelines in open desert is a peculiar experience, because there is nothing else on the horizon, and beneath the sand at your feet is a river the width of a room, running quietly north, made entirely of rain that fell before agriculture existed. The 36th fact is about geltas, which are the desert's small miracles. Where a rock gorge is deep enough and narrow enough to keep the sun off the floor for most of the day, rainwater that falls on the highlands during the rare storms collects in pools that never fully dry. The most famous is in the Ennedi Massif of northeastern Chad, a long, narrow canyon of dark water lying in permanent shade between walls of red sandstone, where the water is stained and the rock above is streaked white by generations of birds and bats. Camels are brought there in numbers to drink, walking down the gorge in files and standing chest deep in a pool in the middle of some of the emptiest country on earth. It is also one of the pools where the marooned crocodiles hang on. A delta is not much to look at compared with a river, and it is often muddy, and it usually smells strongly of animals. It is also, in a landscape measured in hundreds of dry miles, the single most important object for a very long way in every direction. The 37th fact is that the desert has rivers, and that they are almost always dry, and that this is precisely what makes them dangerous. A wadi is a valley cut by running water in a place that only occasionally has any. It may go 5 or 10 or 30 years without flowing at all, and it will look for that entire time. Like a pleasant flat-bottomed corridor of firm sand and gravel with a little shade, which is why it is often exactly where people choose to camp and where roads are routed. Then a thunderstorm breaks over high ground, perhaps 40 miles away, on ground so hard and so bare that nothing soaks in, and every drop of it runs off at once and concentrates into the channel. The flood arrives with no rain falling overhead and no cloud visible, moving fast, carrying boulders, and filling the wadi from side to side in minutes. In desert countries, the standard advice, repeated for generations, is never to sleep in a wadi bed, however dry it looks, and the advice exists because it has been learned expensively many times. Afterwards, within a day or two, the water is gone, the sand is smooth, and the corridor looks entirely harmless again. The 38th fact is a set of rainfall numbers, which are worth hearing slowly because they are hard to accept. Much of the central Sahara receives less than 1 inch of rain in an average year. Considerable areas average under half an inch. And an average in this context is a misleading way to describe what actually happens, because the rain does not arrive in modest annual installments. It arrives as one storm, once, and then not again for a long time. There are places in southern Libya and southern Egypt where more than a decade has passed between measurable rainfalls, and where the annual average is a statistical artifact assembled from one wet afternoon divided by 12 dry years. When rain does come to such a place, the effect is immediate and startling. Seeds that have been lying in the sand for years germinate within days. Small green plants appear across ground that had been bare within living memory. Insects hatch, and for 2 or 3 weeks, a valley can look almost like a meadow before it goes back to being what it was. The 39th fact concerns the western coast, where the desert meets the Atlantic, and something quite different happens. A cold ocean current runs north to south along that shore, and when warm desert air moves out over it, the air chills and its moisture condenses into a persistent bank of fog. That fog rolls inland at night for several miles, soaking everything it touches, and although the rain gauge in those places may register almost nothing from one year to the next, the amount of water that arrives on surfaces as condensed fog is substantial. Lichens grow on the stones there, gray-green and dry looking by day, swelling and turning soft within minutes of the fog arriving. Certain beetles and plants have arrangements for harvesting it directly, and people have experimented with large mesh nets strung across ridges to comb drinking water out of the passing cloud, which works, and which produces a supply measured in hundreds of liters on a good night from a single net. It is a desert that gets its water from the air rather than the sky. The 40th fact is about salt, which is where all that vanished water ends up. Water that flows into a closed desert basin cannot leave except by evaporating, and everything dissolved in it stays behind. So over thousands of years, these basins accumulate salt in enormous quantity. The result is a chat or a sebka, a flat pan of crusted salt and mud that can stretch for tens of miles. Blinding white in the sun, with a surface that in places will hold a vehicle and in other places will not hold a person. The Chat el Djerid in Tunisia is one of the largest, a shimmering plain that in the wet season becomes a shallow sheet of water, and in the dry season a hard glittering crust that cracks into polygons. Because the surface is perfectly flat and the air above it is superheated, these pans generate some of the most extravagant mirages in the world, and travelers crossing them have described lakes, cliffs, and cities standing in the air with complete conviction. There is water there of a sort. It is simply water with so much salt in it that it has become another kind of ground. 40 of them gone, and none of them needed. That is worth saying again, because the mind at this hour has a habit of trying to keep score. Nothing here is going to be asked for later. If the aquifer has already slipped away, and the tunnels, and the salt pans, and the name of the depression that lies below the level of the sea, that is exactly as it should be, and the facts are not offended. They will still be true in the morning without any assistance whatsoever. The next stretch goes upward, which is the natural direction from here, because having spent a while underneath the sand, the only place left to go is above it. And the sky over the Sahara is one of the genuine wonders of the planet, for the same reason that everything else out there is difficult, which is dryness. Water in the air is what makes skies hazy, what holds heat in after dark, what smears the stars into twinkling, and what softens the edges of distant things. Take it out, and the result is a landscape where the nights are cold enough for frost after days hot enough to blister, where the horizon is knife-sharp at 40 miles, where the shadows have edges you could cut paper with, and where the number of stars visible at once is large enough to be genuinely disorienting to somebody who has only ever seen a suburban sky. It is the clarity that people remember, not the heat, which is merely uncomfortable and is over by evening, but the clarity, and specifically the clarity at night, lying on a ground sheet on a cooling dune with a jacket on, looking up into something that has no depth cues at all, and feeling the ordinary sense of being on top of a planet quietly reverse itself into the far strangest sense of hanging underneath one. Let the head tip back a little for the next 10. Loosen the jaw. Let the shoulders go down another inch. There is nothing overhead but a great deal of very old light arriving from a long way off, and it has been on its way for so long that there is really no hurry about receiving it. One small practical thing, offered only because it is pleasant to imagine. Everybody who is camped in the Sahara reports the same sequence, and it is the reverse of what anyone expects. The afternoon is so hot that the idea of ever wanting a blanket seems like a joke. By 9 in the evening, a shirt is sufficient. By 11, a jacket is welcome. By 2 in the morning, the person who is laughing about blankets at 4 o'clock is inside every item of clothing they own. Wearing a hat, lying on the still warm sand rather than on a ground sheet because the sand holds its heat longer than anything else available, and thinking with genuine affection about the sun. And then at about 6, the light comes back over the ridge, and the cold goes out of the air within 20 minutes, and by 9, the whole cycle is set up to repeat. Nothing about the desert is moderate. It simply swings hard, twice a day, forever, and everything that lives there is organized around being somewhere else when each swing arrives. Let the next 10 facts happen in that cold, clear middle part, which is the best of it. The 41st fact is about the swing between day and night, which in the Sahara is larger than almost anywhere else on the surface of the planet. Moisture in the air is what holds heat in after dark, and there is essentially none, so when the sun goes down, the warmth that has been standing on the sand all day rises straight up through a transparent sky and radiates away into space without anything to catch it. A summer afternoon that reaches 115 degrees Fahrenheit can be followed by a night that drops into the 50s. And in winter, the same mechanism produces afternoons that are pleasant and nights that go well below freezing. Frost forms on the sand. Water left in a shallow dish will skin over with ice under a sky that was blistering 9 hours earlier. Travelers who have never experienced it are almost always caught out by it, because it feels like a contradiction and the body does not anticipate it. And every experienced desert traveler carries far more clothing than seems reasonable at noon. The stone plateaus feel it worse than the dunes, because bare rock sheds heat faster than sand, and shepherds sleeping out on the Hamada will build a small wall of stones on the windward side and lie against it in a blanket, curled small, waiting for the sun. The rock itself expands and contracts through that daily swing, and over centuries the expansion and contraction alone is enough to split boulders apart with a crack that can be heard in the stillness, so that the desert at night makes noises that sound distinctly like something moving and is only the ground taking off its coat. The 42nd fact concerns heat records, and it comes with a caution attached. For most of the 20th century, the highest air temperature ever officially recorded on Earth was credited to a place in the Libyan desert, a reading of 136 degrees Fahrenheit taken in 1922. That record stood for 90 years and was then formally struck down after a careful review found that the thermometer had been read by an inexperienced observer using an unsuitable instrument on a surface that would have inflated the number. The title passed back to Death Valley in California. But the Sahara has nothing to apologize for. Across enormous areas of it, summer afternoons above 118 degrees are entirely routine, and satellite instruments that measure the temperature of the ground itself rather than the air have recorded surfaces in the Sahara and neighboring deserts approaching 160 degrees, which is hot enough to cook. The distinction between air temperature and ground temperature is not academic out there. The air at head height might be merely brutal, while the sand at the feet is genuinely dangerous, which is why every animal that lives on that surface either burrows beneath it or stands on very long legs to lift its body up out of the hottest layer, or moves only at the ends of the day. The 43rd fact is that it snows in the Sahara, not often, but often enough that people photograph it and put the pictures in the newspapers. The town most associated with it is Ain Sefra in northwestern Algeria, sitting at around 3,000 feet on the edge of the Atlas Mountains, where the desert begins. Snow fell there in 1979 and did not fall again for 37 years, and then fell again in 2016, and in 2018, and in 2021. In some of those events it lay several inches deep and dressed whole dunes in white, so that the red sand showed through in stripes where the wind had scoured the crests, which is one of the strangest-looking landscapes that has ever been recorded anywhere. It usually lasts hours rather than days. Higher up, in the Tibesti and the Ahagar and along the High Atlas, snow is a normal winter feature rather than a curiosity, and the peaks hold it for weeks. Snow on a sand dune is a good reminder that the Sahara is defined by dryness and not by heat at all, and that its winters, especially at altitude and especially at night, are a serious matter that the postcards leave out entirely. The 44th fact is that the Sahara is one of the sunniest places on Earth, which sounds obvious and turns out to be quantifiable. Parts of the eastern Sahara receive something in the region of 4,000 hours of bright sunshine a year, which is close to the theoretical maximum for the latitude and means that cloud cover is effectively negligible. There are meteorological stations there whose long-term records show a mean cloud amount so small that it barely registers, and there are years in which certain sites recorded no measurable precipitation whatever and virtually no cloudy days. What that produces, in practice, is a landscape of extraordinary optical clarity, where the shadows are hard-edged, the colors are saturated, and distances are systematically underestimated, because there is no haze to give the eye its usual cues about how far away a hill is. A range of mountains that looks like a 2-hour walk turns out to be a 2-day walk. Astronomers value that same clarity, and several observatories sit on the desert's highlands and margins for exactly the reason that the air above them is thin, still, and almost entirely without water vapor. The 45th fact is what all of that clarity does to the night sky, and it is the reason a great many people go out there at all. With no humidity, no cloud, and across most of the interior, no artificial light within 100 miles in any direction, the Sahara offers about as good a view of the universe as the surface of this planet provides. The band of the Milky Way is not a faint smudge, but a structured object with visible dark lanes running through it, bright enough to cast a perceptible glow on pale sand. Several thousand stars are visible at once to an ordinary eye. Planets are bright enough to be uncomfortable to look at directly and throw a faint shadow. Satellites cross constantly, and because the air is so still, the stars twitch far less than they do elsewhere, so that instead of the familiar sparkle, they hang steady, which makes the sky look closer and considerably more solid than it usually does. The old caravan routes were navigated by exactly this sky, using a small number of named stars and the pole for direction, and there are accounts of guides who could hold a course through featureless sand for an entire night by keeping a particular star in a particular relation to their own left shoulder, checking it perhaps twice an hour, and arriving in the morning within sight of a well. The 46th fact is that the Sahara is the best place on Earth to find things that fell out of that sky. Meteorites land everywhere on the planet at roughly the same rate, but almost all of them land in oceans, forests, farmland, or ice, and are lost. In the Sahara, they land on a flat, pale gravel plain with no vegetation whatsoever, where a dark stone is visible from a considerable distance, and where the dryness means they weather very slowly and can lie undisturbed for tens of thousands of years. As a result, an enormous fraction of all the meteorites in the world's collections were picked up off North African gravel. And there is an entire trade of desert nomads and dealers who know exactly what to look for. Specimens are cataloged with a designation indicating Northwest Africa, followed by a number, and the numbers now run into the tens of thousands. Among them have been fragments of the Moon and fragments of Mars, blasted off those bodies by impacts thrown across space for millions of years, and finally coming to rest on a gravel plain in Algeria or Libya, where a person walking slowly with their eyes down eventually noticed a stone that did not belong. The 47th fact is about a substance that exists in only one place, and whose origin was argued over for most of a century. Scattered across a remote corner of the Sand Sea in western Egypt are pieces of natural glass, pale yellow-green, translucent, some of them the size of a fist. They are almost pure silica. They are around 29 million years old, and they are found nowhere else on the planet in that form. Stone tools were chipped from them in prehistory. A superb carved scarab of the material sits at the center of a pectoral ornament recovered from the tomb of Tutankhamun, which means that a piece of this glass was carried several hundred miles across the desert more than 3,000 years ago by somebody who thought it was worth the trouble. The origin is still debated, but the leading explanation is that a large object either struck or exploded low over the ground and produced heat sufficient to melt the desert surface across a wide area, turning sand into glass in a matter of seconds. Whatever happened, it happened once, long before there was anyone to see it. And the evidence of it is lying loose on the sand today, where anyone walking there can pick it up. The 48th fact is about mirages, which are not illusions of the mind, but ordinary optics behaving honestly under unusual conditions. On a hot desert surface, the air immediately above the ground becomes much hotter, and therefore much less dense than the air a few feet higher. And light passing at a shallow angle through that gradient bends upward, so that a ray coming down from the sky is curved back up into the eye and appears to have come from the ground. The result is a shimmering pool of sky lying on the sand ahead, which retreats as it is approached because the geometry retreats with the observer. Everything that stands near it appears to have a reflection in it, exactly as it would beside water, which is precisely why the illusion has been so persistently convincing for so long. The rarer and more dramatic version happens over cold surfaces, such as salt flats at dawn, where the gradient runs the other way and images are lifted, stretched, and stacked into towering vertical distortions, so that a low ridge 20 miles off can appear as a wall of cliffs or a line of buildings hanging above the horizon. Every traveler's account of a phantom city in the desert is that, and it is entirely real light doing entirely real physics. The 49th fact concerns silence, which is one of the things people most consistently report and least expect. In a dune field on a still night, there is nothing to make a sound. There are no leaves, no water, no insects in numbers, no traffic, and no distant hum of anything at all. Worse or better, sand absorbs sound rather than reflecting it, so there is no echo and no reverberation, and a shout dies about 10 feet away as though it has been swallowed. People who spend their first night out in it frequently describe hearing their own pulse, their own breathing, and the small clicking of their own joints, and describe finding the experience unnerving for perhaps an hour, and then extraordinarily restful. Sound carries strangely as well. Because the air near the ground at night is cooler than the air above it, sound waves are bent back downward instead of escaping, so a voice or a bell can occasionally be heard clearly from several miles away across flat ground, arriving out of a silence so complete that it seems to come from nowhere. That effect is very likely the origin of a good many of the desert's ghost stories. The 50th fact is about the small noises that fill that silence once the ears adjust to it. Because the desert at night is not actually empty of sound, It is only quiet enough to require attention. Sand that has been heated all day cools unevenly after dark and settles, and a dune slope in the hours after sunset makes a faint, continuous granular ticking. Thousands of individual grains shifting fractions of a millimeter as the surface contracts. Rocks split with sharp reports. The wind, when it comes, does not roar in a dune field because there is nothing for it to catch. So it makes instead a soft, dry sibilance close to the ground, like sugar poured slowly onto paper. Small nocturnal animals that were entirely absent by day come out onto the surface, and their tracks in the morning show that the whole area was busy all night, though almost nothing was heard, and every so often there is one clean, unexplained noise from a long way off, arriving through that bent, cool air with perfect clarity, which is almost certainly a stone falling somewhere, and which the mind, lying on its back under several thousand visible stars, will happily accept has anything at all. Halfway, 50 facts on one side and 50 on the other, and if the count has become vague by now, that is a good sign rather than a bad one. And it is certainly not something to correct. The pace does not change for the second half. Nothing is building toward anything. There is no conclusion being assembled quietly in the background that will require the listener to be present at the end. Everything so far has been about the desert as a physical object, which is to say, the sand, the stone, the buried water, the wind, the sky, and the enormous stretches of time in which those things rearrange themselves. All of that would be exactly the same on a planet with nothing living on it at all. The next stretch is about the small number of things that decided, despite everything, to live there anyway. It is a short list by the standards of most places, and every item on it is a solution to the same three problems, which are heat, thirst, and the fact that food is not evenly distributed. What is remarkable is not that the solutions exist, but how different they are from one another. One animal grew ears the size of its own head and turned them into radiators. One learned to run across ground hot enough to kill it, quickly, during the 10 minutes when nothing else can be outside, to eat it. One stopped drinking altogether. One swims through sand. One buries itself and switches off for a month. One grew 100 feet of root to hold up 15 feet of tree. And several thousand small annual plants solved it by declining to be present at all except during the 4 weeks after a serious rain, and by being willing to wait 15 years in the soil for that rain, without any apparent impatience. So the scale comes down now from continents and orbital cycles and buried oceans to something the size of a hand, then something the size of a thumbnail, then something small enough to walk under a stone. Let it get small. It is easier to fall asleep to small things. There is one more thing to notice before the scale comes down, which is that none of these creatures is struggling. That is a habit of description worth putting aside. Nothing out there is heroically enduring a hostile environment, because to the fox and the ant and the skink there is no hostile environment. There is only the place which is the only place there has ever been, and which is provided with everything they require. The heat is not an ordeal to them any more than the rain is an ordeal to a duck. They are not making the best of it. They are simply at home in ordinary conditions, doing ordinary things, and it is only from the outside, from the point of view of a large sweating mammal that needs to drink several times a day and cannot dig, that any of it looks difficult. Hold that lightly through the next stretch. It takes the tension out of the descriptions, which is the point at this hour. Nothing coming up is in distress. Everything coming up is comfortable in its own way, in a place that was measured out for it a very long time ago. The 51st fact is about the fennec fox, which is the smallest fox in the world and has the largest ears relative to its body of any animal in the dog family. Those ears are not primarily for hearing, although the hearing is excellent and a fennec can locate an insect moving under the sand. They are radiators. They are thin, richly supplied with blood vessels close to the surface and held up into whatever moving air there is, so that warm blood passing through them sheds heat straight into the atmosphere before returning to the body. A fennec weighs about the same as a small domestic cat and is pale sand cream all over, including the soles of its feet, which are furred over the pads so that it can cross ground hot enough to blister a bare hand without discomfort and can also dig without the sand cutting it. It spends the day underground in a burrow that may run 30 feet and have several entrances, in air that is far cooler and far more humid than the surface, and it comes out after dark. Most remarkably, a fennec in the wild does not need to drink. It gets what it needs from the bodies of the insects, small reptiles, roots and fruits it eats, and its kidneys concentrate waste so efficiently that very little is lost. It can survive indefinitely without ever encountering standing water, which is a fairly extreme adaptation, and explains how an animal that small manages to live in the middle of the largest hot desert on the planet without needing to be near anything at all. The 52nd fact concerns the great pale antelope of the Sahara, and it is a fact with a sad middle and a hopeful end. The ibex is a heavy, weight-coated antelope with long, spiraling horns that lives in true desert in sand seas where nothing else of that size can, and it is possibly the most desert-adapted large mammal on Earth. Its coat turns almost pure white in summer to reflect the sun and grayish-brown in winter to absorb it. Its hooves are broad and splayed for soft sand. Like the fennec, it does not need to drink, taking all its water from the sparse grasses and succulents it finds, and it can follow rainfall across hundreds of miles by some means that is still not fully understood, arriving at patches of new growth that appeared only days earlier. Its close relative, the scimitar-horned oryx, a taller animal with long back-swept horns, once moved across the desert's southern fringe in herds numbering in the thousands. Both animals were reduced almost to nothing over the 20th century, and the oryx was for a time declared extinct in the wild. Then, from animals kept in reserves and collections, a careful reintroduction was begun into a vast protected reserve in Chad, and the released animals not only survived, but bred. And calves have now been born in the wild to mothers who were themselves born in the wild. There are oryx walking in the Sahara again, which for a while looked as though it would never be true. The 53rd fact is about an insect that runs on the surface of ground hot enough to kill it, on purpose, as a strategy. The Saharan silver ant waits out the morning in its nest and emerges in the middle of the day, at the precise moment when the sand temperature has climbed high enough to have killed or driven off every lizard that would otherwise eat it, and it has roughly 10 minutes to work in before the heat kills the ant as well. It uses that window to collect the bodies of insects that have already succumbed to the heat, which is a food supply nothing else is available to compete for. To survive at all, it has 3 separate tricks. It is one of the fastest-running animals on Earth for its size, covering something like 100 times its own body length in a single second, which keeps its feet in contact with the burning sand for as short a time as possible. It runs on very long legs that hold its body up out of the thin, scorching layer immediately above the surface, and its body is covered in triangular hairs with a silvery cross-section that reflect sunlight and radiate its own heat away with unusual efficiency, giving it the polished metallic look that gives it its name. When the window closes, it returns underground and the surface goes back to being empty. The 54th fact is about the jerboa, which looks so improbable that people meeting one for the first time usually assume it has been invented. It is a small rodent that stands upright on hind legs several times the length of its body, with a long tufted tail for balance, and it does not run, it hops in fast, unpredictable arcs that can carry it a considerable distance in a single bound and make it very difficult for anything to intercept. Some species have ears longer than their heads. Like the fennec and the addax, it does not drink, extracting all the water it requires from seeds and plant material, and its kidneys are among the most efficient in the mammal world. It sleeps through the heat in a burrow whose entrance it plugs with sand behind itself, which keeps the humidity in and the heat out. And in the worst part of summer, some species will simply seal themselves in and go dormant for weeks, dropping their metabolism until conditions improve. Its tracks are one of the most common things to see at dawn on a fresh sand surface. Two neat paired impressions repeating away over a dune with a fine line drawn between them by the dragging tail tip, and no sign whatever of the animal itself. The 55th fact is that some desert animals do not travel on the sand at all. They travel through it. The sandfish is a small skink, smooth-scaled and polished, with a wedge-shaped snout, countersunk eyes, and a lower jaw that fits inside the upper one, and it moves below the surface of loose sand by holding its short legs against its sides and swimming with a side-to-side undulation of the body, exactly as an eel swims through water. It can travel yards in a few seconds and disappear from the surface in under a second. Under the sand, it is safe from the sun, safe from birds, and effectively invisible, and it hunts by feeling the vibrations of insects walking overhead. Its scales are extraordinarily smooth and hard, so much so that engineers have studied them looking for ways to reduce abrasion in machinery that handles powders. It is not alone down there. A whole community lives in the top few inches of loose sand, including certain beetles, larvae, and other lizards. All of them exploiting the fact that sand is a poor conductor of heat, so that half a foot below a surface at 150 degrees the temperature is merely warm, and a foot below that it is cool. The 56th fact is about the desert's smaller and less popular residents and about how thoroughly the heat has organized their days. Scorpions, of which the Sahara has a good many species, spend the daylight hours pressed into rock crevices or several inches down in sand and emerge after dark to hunt by feeling vibrations through fine sensory hairs on their legs, which allow them to locate an insect walking a short distance away in total darkness. They can go for extraordinary lengths of time without eating, some species for the better part of a year, by dropping their metabolic rate to a fraction of its usual level and simply waiting. The desert also holds the long-legged, fast-moving arachnids often called camel spiders, which are harmless to people despite an alarming reputation and which chase shade rather than chasing anybody. So that a person sitting still in the sun will occasionally acquire one at their feet following the only moving patch of shadow available. Darkling beetles trundle across the surface in the cool hours, tilting themselves nose down on ridges in fog country so that condensation runs along channels in their shells and down to their mouthparts. None of this is visible in the middle of the day. Walk out at noon and the desert appears entirely lifeless, and walk out at 11 at night with a light held low, and the sand is a busy crossroads with tracks going in every direction, and the ground turns out to have been full the whole time. The 57th fact is that the date palm is not decoration. It is the reason an oasis is possible at all. A mature date palm can stand its roots in slightly salty water, tolerate heat that kills almost everything else, and still produce a heavy annual crop of fruit that dries naturally on the tree and will then keep for a year or more without any processing whatsoever. That last property is what makes it a desert crop rather than merely a desert plant. Because a food that stores itself is a food that can be carried across 400 miles of nothing. But the palm's greater gift is shade. Oasis agriculture across the Sahara is built in 3 stories. The palms form the top layer, breaking the sun and cutting the wind. Beneath them, in the filtered light, grow smaller fruit trees, pomegranate, fig, apricot, citrus, and beneath those, on the ground in the deepest shade, grow the vegetables and the fodder and the barley. Each layer shelters the one below it, and the humidity trapped under the canopy can be dramatically higher than the air 100 yards away outside the grove. Standing at the edge of an oasis in the afternoon, you can cross that boundary in a single step, out of glare and dry wind and into a green, dim, faintly damp, rustling room where the temperature drops noticeably and the light comes down in coins. The 58th fact is about a single tree that was, for a time, the most isolated tree on the planet. In the middle of the TNR in Niger, in a stretch of sand with no other vegetation of any kind, there stood a solitary acacia. The nearest other tree was more than 250 miles away. It was a survivor of the green period, kept alive by a water table far below, and when a well was dug beside it, the diggers found its roots reaching down more than 100 feet to reach water. Caravans used it as a landmark for generations, and it was marked on maps as a navigational point, on maps that otherwise had nothing at all to mark for hundreds of miles in any direction. It was not tall, and it was not beautiful. It was a thorny, wind-scoured, half-dead acacia that had been browsed by passing camels for a very long time. In 1973, it was knocked down by a truck, in an emptiness where a driver would have had to work quite hard to hit anything, and the remains were taken to the National Museum in Niamey, and a simple metal sculpture was erected in its place. That sculpture is still there. People still stop at it. It is a memorial in the middle of a sand sea to a tree, which tells you something about how much a single living thing can mean in a place that has almost none. The 59th fact is that a great deal of the desert's plant life is not absent. It is waiting. Across enormous areas of the Sahara, the soil holds a bank of seeds, some of them decades old, coated in chemical inhibitors that will not break down until a genuinely substantial soaking has occurred, which is a way of making sure the plant does not commit itself to a false start after a light shower. When a real storm finally comes, the response is immediate. Within days, ground that had been bare gravel for years is faintly green. Within 2 weeks, it can be carpeted with small flowering annuals running through their entire lives at extraordinary speed, germinating, growing, flowering, setting seed, and dying inside a month or 6 weeks, because that is the whole of the opportunity available. Insects hatch to meet them, birds arrive from somewhere to meet the insects, and for a short season, a valley that appeared on every map as empty desert is a functioning meadow with pollinators in it. Then it dries, the annuals shrivel to nothing, the wind takes the stems, and the seed goes back into the ground to wait. It may wait 1 year. It may wait 15. The plant is perfectly indifferent to which, having been designed by a very long apprenticeship in exactly this kind of uncertainty. The 60th fact is about roots, and about the fact that the interesting part of a desert plant is usually the part nobody sees. A tamarisk or an acacia standing perhaps 15 feet tall on an open plain may have a root system going down more than 100 feet and spreading sideways for a distance many times its own height, so that the visible plant is a small green flag on top of an enormous invisible investment. Some desert shrubs put down a single deep taproot to reach permanent moisture and simultaneously spread a shallow mat of fine roots just under the surface to catch the occasional shower before it evaporates, running 2 entirely different water strategies at once. The proportions are extreme. It is not unusual for the underground mass of a desert plant to exceed the above-ground mass several times over, which is the exact reverse of a forest. And because growth is so slow and so hard-won, the plants themselves are frequently far older than they look. A gnarled, waist-high, unremarkable shrub on a stony plain in the central Sahara may have been sitting in that same spot, adding a few millimeters in the good years and nothing in the bad ones since before the invention of the printing press, and it will still be there unchanged, long after everybody currently alive has stopped worrying about anything at all. There is a pleasant symmetry in the next stretch, and it can be handed over gently, without any need to follow it closely. Everything just described lives in the desert permanently, and has arranged its entire existence around staying there. What comes next is about the traffic. Because for all its reputation as a place where nothing moves, the Sahara is one of the busiest thoroughfares on the planet, and almost all of that traffic passes overhead at night, invisible at several thousand feet, in numbers that are difficult to believe. Billions of small birds cross it twice a year. Some of them do it in one continuous flight lasting 2 days and nights, having first doubled their own body weight in fat for the purpose, and having never been told by anybody where they are going or how far it is. And the desert exports itself in the other direction, upward and outward, as dust. 100 and more million tons of it a year, lifted mostly from one small dry basin at the foot of a mountain range in Chad, carried west across an ocean, and delivered. A few micrograms at a time, onto a rainforest that needs it, and onto the open sea where it feeds things too small to see, and onto the Alps where it turns the snow faintly pink, and onto cars in Florida where it merely annoys people. So the picture that ought to be forming now, and then immediately allowed to go soft, is of an enormous, quiet surface with 2 great flows moving over it in opposite directions. Birds going south in the dark and dust going west in the daylight, and neither of them stopping, and neither of them aware of the other, and the sand below entirely unbothered by any of it. Nothing needs to be held on to for the next 10. Let the breathing lengthen. The birds have been doing this for longer than there have been people to notice, and they will manage the rest of the night without supervision. The scale of the invisibility is the part that stays with people. On any given night in early autumn, there may be more small birds in the air over the Sahara than there are people in a large country, and a person standing directly beneath all of it on a dune in the dark with their head tipped back will see nothing, hear nothing, and have no reason whatsoever to suspect it. The same is true of the dust in daylight. It goes over at 10 or 15,000 feet, thin enough that the sky merely looks slightly milky, and it is on its way to fertilize a forest on another continent, and nobody underneath it looks up. There is something soothing about a world that carries on with its largest operations entirely out of view. It suggests quite strongly that being present for things is optional, and that a great deal of what is going on perfectly well without any observation at all, which is a reasonable thing to be thinking about while lying still in the dark, doing nothing, and gradually becoming less present for this. The 61st fact is that twice a year, several billion birds fly directly over the Sahara, and that most of them do it without stopping. Every autumn, the songbirds that spent the summer in Europe head south to winter in Africa, and the desert lies squarely across the route, a barrier 1,000 miles deep with no food, no water, and no shelter. Some species go around it along the coasts. A great many simply go over. The estimates of how many birds make that crossing run into the billions across the 2 seasons combined, which means that on a given night in September, there may be tens of millions of small birds in the air above the sand at once, invisible, flying at altitudes of several thousand feet, navigating by stars and by the Earth's magnetic field. Radar studies have shown them passing over in broad fronts hundreds of miles wide. Nothing on the ground registers any of it. A person camped on a dune on such a night, hearing nothing but the small dry noises of sand cooling, is lying underneath one of the largest movements of living things that happens anywhere on the planet, and would need a radar set to know. The 62nd fact is what that crossing costs the individual bird, and it is a genuinely astonishing piece of arithmetic. A willow warbler weighs about as much as 2 sheets of paper. Before departure, it feeds intensively on insects and fruit, and roughly doubles its body weight in fat, until it is visibly round, at which point it launches and flies for anything from 30 to 60 hours continuously. It arrives on the far side having burned nearly all of that fat and a certain amount of its own muscle. And it lands looking like a completely different and much thinner bird. Some species, if they have fed well and the winds are kind, cross the entire desert in a single flight. Others come down at dawn wherever they happen to be, spend the day sitting in the shade of a rock or a single scrub bush, not feeding because there is nothing to feed on, and go up again at dusk. The northern wheater, a bird small enough to sit comfortably in a cupped hand, makes an annual round trip that for some populations runs from the Arctic to Central Africa and back, crossing the Sahara twice each year for its whole life, which may be 7 or 8 years. Nobody teaches it the route. The 63rd fact is about the desert locust, which is an ordinary and rather solitary grasshopper right up until it is not. Under normal dry conditions, the insects live scattered and alone across the arid belt, avoiding one another, colored a modest sandy brown. But after rain, when vegetation flushes and the population concentrates on the green patches, the insects begin to touch one another, and the repeated contact on their hind legs triggers a change of state. Within a generation or two, they alter color to bright yellow and black. They change shape. their brains enlarge, and their entire behavior reverses from avoiding company to actively seeking it. The result is a swarm. A large swarm can contain tens of billions of insects, cover hundreds of square miles, and travel 100 miles in a day, riding the wind. And it consumes vegetation on a scale that has shaped the history and the food security of every country along the desert's southern edge. From a distance, a swarm looks like a low brown cloud that behaves incorrectly. From inside it, the sound is a dry, continuous rustle. And when the rains fail again and the insects disperse, they revert, over a couple of generations, to being unremarkable brown grasshoppers minding their own business in the scrub. The 64th fact concerns the single dustiest place on the surface of the earth, and it is not a large place. In the far north of Chad, at the foot of the Tibesti Mountains, lies the Bottle Depression, a low basin that is part of the exposed floor of the vanished Lake Mega Chad. The sediment there is diatomite, the compacted remains of countless microscopic freshwater algae that lived and died in that lake over thousands of years, and it is exceptionally light, exceptionally fine, and extremely rich in phosphorus and iron. The geography of the surrounding mountains funnels the northeasterly wind through a gap and accelerates it directly across this basin for around 100 days a year, and each time it does, it lifts an enormous quantity of that ancient lake bed into the air. The bottle alone is thought to supply a very large share of all the dust that leaves the Sahara, from an area that is a rounding error on a map of the continent. It is, in effect, a machine assembled by accident out of a dead lake in a mountain-shaped nozzle, and it has been running for thousands of years. The 65th fact is the total, which is difficult to hold in the head. Somewhere between 100 and 200 million tons of mineral dust is lifted out of the Sahara every year and carried away on the wind. It is the largest source of airborne dust on the planet by a wide margin. Some of it travels only a few hundred miles and falls again inside Africa. A great deal of it crosses the Atlantic. Some of it circles most of the way around the world. Individual particles are tiny, a few micrometers across, small enough to remain suspended for a week or more, and they are lifted to altitudes of 10 or 15,000 feet, where the winds are fast and steady. What that means in practice is that the Sahara is not a closed system sitting quietly in North Africa. It is constantly exporting itself. Every year, a layer of a fraction of a millimeter thick is removed and delivered somewhere else on Earth, and has been for as long as it has been a desert, which is a very long time, and the places where all of that lands turn out to be surprisingly important. The 66th fact is that the Sahara feeds a rainforest on the other side of an ocean. Every year, something in the region of 20 to 30 million tons of Saharan dust falls on the Amazon basin, carried more than 3,000 miles across the Atlantic on the trade winds, and the significance of it is not the weight, but the chemistry. Rainforest soils are famously poor. The rain that falls there is so constant and so heavy that nutrients are washed downward and out of reach, and phosphorus in particular, which every living thing needs to build the machinery of its own cells, is steadily stripped out of the system and carried away by the rivers. Something has to replace it, and a surprising share of that replacement arrives from the sky as dust. And a very large share of that dust comes from one small dry basin in northern Chad, from the bed of a lake that dried up thousands of years ago, made of the skeletons of freshwater algae that lived in that lake and stored phosphorus in their bodies while they did. So the great green forest on one continent is fertilized, in part by the ghost of a great blue lake on another, delivered a few micrograms at a time, in a haze so thin that nobody standing under it would notice, over and over, for as long as anyone has been in a position to measure it. It is one of the largest and least visible connections in the natural world, and it is entirely automatic, and neither end of it has any idea. The 67th fact is about what that dust does to weather in the Atlantic, and it is a good example of something enormous hiding in plain sight. Between late spring and early autumn, the Saharan air that lifts off the coast of West Africa forms a distinct layer 3 or 4 kilometers thick, hot, extremely dry, laden with dust, and traveling west at speed above the cooler, wetter marine air beneath it. Meteorologists call it the Saharan air layer, and it can be tracked across the whole ocean on satellite imagery as a great pale plume with a hard leading edge. Where it passes, it suppresses the formation of tropical storms, because storms need deep moist air to build in, and this layer smothers the top of the column with dryness and adds a strong wind shear that tears developing systems apart. In summers, with heavy dust outbreaks, the Atlantic hurricane season is measurably quieter. The same plumes reach the Caribbean and the southeastern United States, where they produce hazy skies, extraordinary red sunsets, and a fine coating of tan grit on cars in Florida and Puerto Rico that people have been noticing and complaining about for generations, usually without knowing that they are dusting off a piece of Chad. The 68th fact is that Europe gets its share too, and that the delivery is sometimes spectacular. When the wind sets up right, Saharan dust rides north across the Mediterranean and falls over southern Europe, occasionally in enormous quantity. Cars from Spain to Poland acquire a uniform ochre film overnight. The sky turns a peculiar sepia in which the sun can be looked at directly, and when the dust falls with rain or snow, the effect is startling, because the Alps and the Pyrenees turn pink. Whole slopes of it, orange-tinted snow, which then, as the season goes on and the surface melts down, concentrates the dust further into vivid rust-colored bands. The dust darkens the snow, and darker snow absorbs more sunlight, so heavy Saharan deposition measurably accelerates the melting of glaciers and snowpack in the mountains of southern Europe. Ice cores drilled from alpine glaciers contain a legible sequence of these events going back centuries, thin brown lines in white ice. Each one the record of a particular week in a particular year, when the wind came from the wrong direction and it rained a desert onto a mountain. The 69th fact is that the same dust falls on the ocean and feeds things there as well. The open sea, far from land, is often a nutrient desert in its own right, and in wide areas of the Atlantic, the growth of the microscopic algae that form the base of the entire marine food web is limited by a shortage of iron. There is essentially no source of iron out in the middle of an ocean except what falls from above. Saharan dust is rich in it. When a plume passes over and settles onto the water, the iron dissolves slowly into the surface layer and blooms of plankton follow, which are then eaten by everything larger, all the way up the chain. Satellite images have caught this happening, the pale plume crossing the water and a faint green flush appearing behind it. Some of those algae, having grown, die and sink, taking carbon down with them into the deep ocean where it stays for centuries, which means that a dry wind blowing over a dead-like bed in Chad is quietly participating in the planet's carbon cycle. Almost nothing about that arrangement was obvious until instruments were placed in orbit and somebody thought to compare two entirely unrelated sets of pictures. The 17th fact is about the haboob, which is what happens when the dust does not leave quietly. On summer afternoons over the desert's southern margin, thunderstorms build, and when a storm collapses, it drops a mass of cold, dense air downward onto the ground, which spreads outward in every direction like water poured on a table. Racing outward across dry country at 40 or 50 miles an hour, that gust front picks up sand and dust and lifts it into a rolling wall that can stand a mile high and stretch for 60 miles from end to end. Advancing across the landscape with a smooth, curling face like a breaking wave. From in front, a haboob looks less like weather and more like a physical object arriving. A solid brown cliff moving steadily toward you with clear sky above it, and the light in the minutes before it hits goes an unearthly orange. Then it arrives, and visibility drops to a few feet, and there is nothing to do but stop, turn away from the wind, cover the face, and wait. It passes in 20 minutes or an hour. Afterwards, the air is clean and cool and washed-looking. The temperature has fallen 10 or 15 degrees. Everything is coated in a fine, even layer of tan, and quite often it rains for a few minutes, which is not enough to matter, and smells, briefly, wonderful. 70 now, and the count is only there as a handrail. It can be let go of at any point. The last stretch was about what the wind carries across the desert without being asked. The next stretch is about what people carried across it on purpose, which is a much smaller quantity moved at a vastly greater cost, and which nevertheless rearranged the history of two continents. It is easy to look at a map of the Sahara and see a blank, and to assume that the interesting things were all happening on either side of it, north along the Mediterranean and south along the Niger. That is not what happened. For something like 1,500 years, the desert was not a barrier, it was a road, and the towns at either end of it grew rich in exactly the way port cities grow rich, because they sat where the traffic had to stop. Salt going south, gold going north, books, cloth, glass, copper, horses, and a very great deal of human suffering moving in both directions, and all of it walking at about 2.5 miles an hour in files for 40 days at a stretch, with the entire enterprise depending on an animal that can drink 30 gallons in 10 minutes and then not drink again for a week. The next 10 facts are about that traffic, and about the people who ran it, and about the towns and libraries and salt mines and hand-dug tunnels that existed because of it. There is no need to keep any of the names. The names are only there for texture, the way the sound of a fire is texture. Let them go past. What is worth taking, if anything is the picture of a very long line of loaded animals moving slowly across a pale plain in the early morning with their shadows thrown out sideways for 30 feet, making almost no noise at all, on a route that somebody memorized, heading for a well that somebody else dug a very long time ago. Try the pace for a moment, because it is the part that never comes through in the histories. 2.5 miles an hour. That is the speed of all of it. The salt, the gold, the books, the news, the arguments, the marriages arranged at one end of the desert and honored at the other. A message sent from the northern coast to the river towns in the south took the better part of 2 months to arrive, and the reply took another 2. And everybody involved simply built their expectations around that. Nothing was urgent, because nothing could be. A caravan left when the season allowed and arrived when it arrived, and if it was 3 weeks late, that was ordinary, and if it was 3 months late, somebody eventually went looking. There is no way to run a panic at 2.5 miles an hour. Whatever anxieties those people had, and they surely had plenty, they were not the kind that come from being able to reach anywhere in an afternoon. Let the next stretch move at that pace. There is no reason for anything tonight to move faster than a loaded camel walking on level sand. The 71st fact is about the people most closely associated with the deep Sahara, and about a piece of clothing. The Tuareg are a Berber people of the Central Desert, spread across what are now southern Algeria, Libya, Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, and for many centuries they controlled the trade routes that crossed the emptiest ground. They are sometimes called the blue men of the desert because of the indigo-dyed cloth traditionally worn by the men, dyed so heavily that the pigment was pounded into the fabric rather than fixed in water, and which transfers onto the skin of the wearer and gives it a faint blue cast over years. The most distinctive garment is the tagelmust, a long veil wound around the head and across the face, worn by men rather than by women, which is the reverse of the arrangement most outsiders expect. It has a practical function, keeping sand and sun off the face and reducing moisture lost in breathing, and it also carries a strong social meaning, so that adjusting it, lowering it, or refusing to lower it in front of certain company is a form of speech. Tuareg society is organized into confederations, is traditionally matrilineal in important respects, and preserves its own alphabet. Women hold property, keep the tents, and historically were the keepers of literacy and music, and the sound most associated with the Tuareg today is the imzad, a single-stringed fiddle played by women, and, more recently, electric guitars played by everybody. The 72nd fact concerns the camel, which is a set of engineering solutions wearing a coat. The hump is fat, not water, and it serves two purposes at once, storing energy compactly and keeping that insulating fat concentrated in a single place on the animal's back where it shields it from the sun without wrapping the whole body in a blanket. A camel can drink something over 30 gallons in about 10 minutes, and its red blood cells are oval rather than round and unusually elastic, so they can survive that sudden dilution without bursting and can also flow when the animal is dehydrated and its blood has thickened. It can lose a quarter of its body weight in water and keep working, a level of dehydration that would kill most mammals. It sweats sparingly, and only after allowing its body temperature to rise several degrees through the day and then shedding that heat overnight, which saves enormous quantities of water. Its nostrils close. Its eyes carry 3 eyelids and 2 rows of long lashes. Its feet are broad, soft, 2-toed pads that spread on sand. It can eat thorn bushes that nothing else will touch, using a hardened mouth lining. Almost every feature of it, including the famously poor temperament, exists because the alternative did not survive the desert. The 73rd fact is that the camel is a relatively recent arrival, and that its arrival changed everything. For most of the green period and for a long time after it, the animals of North Africa were cattle, and then horses drawing light chariots, both of which need water often, and neither of which can cross serious desert. The single humped camel appears to have been domesticated in Arabia and to have reached the Sahara in numbers only in the first few centuries of the Common Era. Once it did, the arithmetic of the continent changed. A journey that had been impossible became merely extremely difficult. Trade that had trickled around the desert's edges could now go straight through the middle of it, and the towns on both shores of that sand ocean, north and south, grew rich on the traffic. Gold, ivory, cola, leather, and enslaved people moved north. Salt, cloth, copper, glass, books, and horses moved south. Whole cities existed for no reason other than that they sat where a camel root touched water. It is worth pausing on how narrow the margin was that made all of it possible, which is essentially the difference between an animal that must drink every day and an animal that need not. The 74th fact is about the salt caravans, which were still running in something close to their old form within living memory. The Azalai is the great seasonal caravan of the Western Sahara, setting out from Timbuktu and the towns of the Niger Bend in the cool season and heading north for the salt mines, and returning loaded. At its height, it involved many thousands of camels moving in a single body, walking in files, with the whole enterprise organized around water in a way that admitted no improvisation whatsoever. The route between the last well and the mine crossed a stretch called, in translation, the Land of Thirst, and the crossing took several days with no water at all, which meant the animals were watered to capacity and then simply endured. There was no shade, there was no forage. Navigation across that section was done by a small number of specialists who read the ground and the stars, and a guide who lost the line did not merely inconvenience the caravan. The caravans moved mostly at night and in the early morning halted through the worst hours, and covered something over 20 miles a day. Motor transport has taken most of the trade now, but not quite all of it, and camel caravans still make the journey, for the straightforward reason that a truck breaks down and a camel eats thorn bushes. The 75th fact is about what those caravans were going to fetch, and about a town made of the thing it sells. Deep in the Malian desert lies Taurarene, a salt mining settlement several hundred miles from anywhere, where a former lake has left thick beds of rock salt lying a few meters below the surface. The salt is cut out by hand in open pits, using hand tools split into rectangular slabs roughly the size of a door panel and a couple of inches thick, then trimmed and dressed so that each one is a standard weight and will balance against its partner on the flank of a camel. The buildings in the settlement are built out of the offcuts, blocks of gray salt mortared with more salt, which is entirely practical in a place where it never rains, and where salt is the only construction material within a very long walk. The slabs travel south by camel or by truck to the river towns, where the trade in them is still active, and it is worth remembering why anyone ever went to that much trouble. In a hot climate, without refrigeration, salt is how food is kept, how animals stay healthy, and how a body that sweats all day stays upright. For centuries it moved south, and gold moved north. And along much of that route the exchange was made at rates that would look, to anyone who has never been thirsty, completely insane. The 76th fact is that one of the great libraries of the medieval world sat on the southern shore of the Sahara. Timbuktu grew up where the camel routes met the Niger River, which made it the transfer point between two entirely different transport systems. And a town that handles everybody's goods eventually handles everybody's ideas as well. By the 15th and 16th centuries, it held a university clustered around its mosques, scholars in considerable numbers, and a book trade substantial enough that contemporary accounts describe manuscripts as the most profitable commodity in the market, more profitable than salt. The manuscripts covered astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law, poetry, grammar, and correspondence. Written in Arabic and in local languages using Arabic script, bound in tooled leather, some of them illuminated in gold. Estimates of how many survive run to several 100,000, held for generations in private family collections, wrapped in cloth, kept in trunks. Passed down and quietly maintained by households who understood exactly what they had. When the region became unstable in the early 21st century, a great many of those manuscripts were evacuated in secret, packed into metal footlockers, and moved out of the city a few at a time by road and by river, hidden under vegetables and in the bottoms of boats, in an operation that saved the large majority of them. Whatever else is true of the desert, it has not been a place without books. The 77th fact concerns a single journey that is still visible in the economic record 700 years later. In the early 14th century, the ruler of the Mali Empire, whose territory sat on the goldfields at the southern end of the trans-Saharan trade, made the pilgrimage to Mecca, and he did not travel lightly. The accounts describe a caravan of thousands of people with baggage camels and a substantial quantity of gold moving north and east across the desert and through Cairo. In Cairo, he gave gold away, spent gold, and distributed gold as gifts on such a scale that he flooded the local market and depressed the value of gold in Egypt for years afterwards, a fact recorded by chroniclers at the time who were trying to work out why prices had gone strange. When word of all this reached Europe, it changed the map, literally. A famous Catalan atlas drawn a few decades later shows a crowned figure seated in the middle of West Africa holding up a gold nugget, and from that point on the European mental image of the far side of the Sahara was of a place where gold came from. That image was drawn from one caravan, crossing one desert, on one journey. And it drove several centuries of European interest in what lay beyond the sand. The 78th fact is about a desert civilization that engineered its way to prosperity and then engineered its way straight into a wall. The Garamantes lived in what is now southwestern Libya, in the Fezzan, from roughly the first millennium before the Common Era through the first several centuries after it. They built towns of mud brick with a capital at Garama. They traded with Rome and with the south. They farmed wheat, barley, dates, and grapes in the middle of a desert. And they did it by tapping the fossil water beneath them with an enormous network of underground tunnels, hand-dug galleries running for a total length estimated in the hundreds of miles. Sunk by an enormous labor force through solid rock and sand. For several centuries the system worked and the population grew. But the water they were drawing was not being replaced, and as the tunnels drained the accessible layer, the water table fell below the reach of the galleries. The only response available was to dig deeper and further, which cost more labor every year for less water, until the arithmetic simply failed. The society contracted, the towns shrank, and the fields went back to sand. Their tunnels are still traceable from the air as long dotted lines of spoil heaps running arrows straight across the desert. The 79th fact is that the Sahara is not culturally empty and never has been, and that the picture of a blank space between two civilizations is a mapmaker's convenience rather than a description. The Amazigh peoples, often called Berbers, are indigenous across North Africa and speak a family of related languages, with the Tuareg forming their southern desert branch. The Tobu live in and around the Tibesti in Chad and southern Libya. In some of the harshest country anywhere, and have a reputation for enduring on almost nothing. The Sahrawi occupy the western desert toward the Atlantic. The Beja live between the Nile and the Red Sea. The oases hold long settled populations with their own histories, and the desert edges hold communities descended from every group that ever crossed. The Tuareg alphabet, Tifana, is a geometric script of dots and lines that has been in continuous use for a very long time, and its ancestor appears in inscriptions carved on desert rock thousands of years old, which makes it one of the older writing systems still being used by anybody. It is written by hand, occasionally on rock, and it is now also printed on road signs, which is a satisfying continuity. The 80th fact is about building in a place that is trying to cook you, and about how thoroughly the problem was solved before anyone had machinery. The old desert towns are built of mud brick, which is a superb material for the climate, because it is thick, dense, and slow, so that heat arriving on the outer face takes most of the day to work its way through the wall and arrives inside in the evening, exactly when the outside air has gone cold and the warmth is welcome. The streets are narrow and often roofed over entirely, so that the town's whole circulation system is in permanent shade, and moving through it in summer is like moving through a cellar. Courtyards are enclosed and often planted, so that each house has its own small, cool well of air. Openings are small and set high. Roofs are used at night. In Gadames, an oasis town in western Libya, sometimes called the Pearl of the Desert, the covered alleyways run for a considerable distance in cool gloom lit by shafts of light from openings above, and the rooftops form an entirely separate upper town, traditionally the women's domain, a connected white terrace where people could walk from house to house above the streets in the open air, under the stars. 80, the stretch that has just gone past, was mostly old, and the stretch that comes next is mostly new, although new in this context means the last 100 years or so, which the desert would not regard as a meaningful interval. The interesting thing about the modern Sahara is how little the underlying arithmetic has changed. Roads have been laid across it, and a train 2 miles long crosses part of it twice a day, carrying iron ore to the sea with people riding on top of the load. And there are mirror fields on the northern edge, turning sunlight into electricity, and satellites overhead have quietly rewritten the human history of the place by photographing ground marks that no one on the surface could ever have seen. And yet the rules have not moved at all. Fuel and water are still hundreds of miles apart. If your vehicle stops you, still stay with your vehicle for precisely the same reason a person on a camel stayed with the caravan. The sand still blows across the tarmac and still has to be cleared, and the technique for stopping it is still a grid of dried palm fronds pushed into the sand upwind, because nothing better has been found. The desert has accepted the machinery politely and has not adjusted a single one of its conditions to accommodate it. So the next stretch is about that, about crossings and railways and mirrors and green walls, and the peculiar fact that the largest pile of sand in the world cannot be used to make concrete. It is the most modern part of this list, and it is still at bottom a story about water and distance, because everything out there is. Let the attention drift wherever it wants during this part. Nothing coming up is important, and the parts of it that are pleasant will be pleasant whether or not they are followed closely. It is worth adding that the desert has not become safe, only better documented. Every year, people who set out across it with modern equipment discover that the equipment does not change the fundamentals, and the fundamentals are that water weighs a great deal, that a vehicle uses more fuel in soft sand than any calculation suggests, that shade must be carried because none is provided, and that distances measured on a screen are honest, but the ground is not. The old rules were arrived at expensively, and they still hold. Travel in the cool hours. Never move at midday if the alternative is waiting. Take twice the water you think is generous. Tell somebody the route and the date you will be out. Stay with the vehicle and treat every well and every fuel stop as though it may not be there, because occasionally it is not. None of that is romantic and all of it is current. The Sahara is crossed routinely now by many people using roads. It is also, for exactly the same reasons it always was, a place that does not offer second attempts to anyone who runs out of water 80 miles from the next tap. The 81st fact is that even inside the Sahara, there is a place people describe as the desert within the desert. The TNR occupies a vast area of north-central Niger and eastern Chad, a level plain of pale sand and gravel bounded by mountains on one side and dune seas on the other, and it is about as close to featureless as the surface of a planet gets. Its name comes from a Tuareg word that simply means desert or emptiness, which is the sort of name people give a place when there is nothing to distinguish. There are stretches where a traveler can stand and turn a full circle and see one continuous unbroken horizon line all the way round with nothing on it at any point, no rock, no rise, no plant, nothing to fix a bearing on. Aircraft crossing it have described the ground below as looking like a blank sheet. Navigation in the TNR was traditionally done by star, by sun, and by an oral knowledge of ground so subtle that outsiders could not perceive what was being read. And the fact that a marked route existed at all across it, used regularly by caravans, is one of the more impressive things human beings have quietly done. Even now, crossing it is treated seriously, because a vehicle stopped in the middle of the TNR is stopped a very long way from anything. The 82nd fact is about one of the longest and heaviest trains in the world, which runs across the desert in Mauritania and carries iron ore from a mine deep in the interior to a port on the Atlantic. The train is regularly over 1.5 miles long and is sometimes reported at more than 2 miles, made up of a couple of hundred open wagons hauled by several locomotives and moving at a steady, modest pace across 400 miles of open desert twice a day. It takes a long time to pass. There is a passenger car on some services at the very back. But a great many people ride on top of the ore instead, sitting up on the loaded wagons in the open air with their luggage and their goods, wrapped against the wind and the dust, because it is free and because it goes where they are going. Photographs from that vantage show a line of wagons curving away over a horizon of pure sand with figures perched along the top of it. On the return leg, the wagons are empty and the ride is rougher. It is, by a considerable margin, the most important piece of infrastructure in that part of the desert, and it exists purely because of a hill full of ore several hundred miles from the sea. The 83rd fact concerns crossing the Sahara today, which is easier than it was and less routine than people assume. There are paved highways now. The trans-Saharan route running south from Algeria toward Niger has been under construction in stages for decades, and much of it is now sealed. And there are surface roads down the Atlantic side through Morocco and Mauritania. On a good road, the crossing that once took 40 days takes a few days of driving. But the desert has not become casual. Fuel stops are hundreds of miles apart. Sand drifts across the tarmac and has to be cleared continually. In places, the road simply ends and resumes, and a gap is crossed on tracks that fan out across open ground with no marking, where drivers navigate between markers and the wrecks of previous vehicles are left in place because they are useful landmarks. Convoys are still normal. Spare fuel, spare water, spare tires, and a shovel are still normal. And the standing advice, unchanged in 1,000 years, is that if the vehicle stops, you stay with the vehicle, because a car is visible from the air and a person walking is not. The 84th fact is that the amount of sunlight falling on the Sahara is difficult to state without sounding as though you are exaggerating. The commonly quoted comparison is that the solar energy landing on a modest fraction of the desert's area in a year is comparable to the total energy used by everyone on the planet. And while the engineering required to actually collect and move any meaningful share of it is enormous, the underlying resource is real, and it is right there. Morocco built one of the world's larger concentrated solar plants near Ouarzazate, on the desert side of the Atlas Mountains, using vast curved mirrors and later a central tower ringed by thousands of tracking heliostats that throw the light onto a single point, heating molten salt that stores the heat well enough to keep generating for hours after sunset. From the ground, the mirror field is a shimmering lake of glass laid out on gravel. From the air, it is a pale disk on brown ground with a bright point at the middle that is genuinely painful to look at. Whether the Sahara ever becomes an energy exporter on a grand scale is an open question, but a desert whose only reliable natural resource has always been sunlight is at least being asked about it. The 85th fact is about a wall that is meant to be made of trees. Along the Sahara's southern edge, across the Sahel, where the desert margin advances and retreats and where drought has repeatedly wrecked farming and herding communities, a coalition of African states began an initiative to plant a belt of vegetation running from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, thousands of miles long. The original image was a literal line of trees, and it has since become something more sensible and more difficult, which is a mosaic of restored land, using tree planting where that works, and more effectively using very old local techniques of soil and water management that were nearly abandoned. Farmers dig shallow pits that catch runoff and concentrate it around a single seedling. They build low stone lines along contours that slow water down and let it soak in. They protect the young shoots that sprout naturally from the surviving root systems of trees that were cut long ago, which turns out to regenerate woodland far faster and far cheaper than planting seedlings ever does. Progress is uneven, and the headline numbers have been revised repeatedly. But there are districts in Niger and Burkina Faso that are visibly greener from orbit than they were 30 years ago, which is not nothing. The 86th fact is about the Sahel, which is the desert's shoreline, and about how appropriate that word is. Sahel comes from an Arabic word meaning coast or shore, and the people who named it were describing exactly what it looks like from the deck of a camel, which is the edge where the ocean of sand meets solid habitable ground. It is a belt several hundred miles wide, running the full width of the continent, where rainfall climbs from almost nothing in the north to a proper wet season in the south, and where the vegetation changes over that distance, from bare gravel with occasional thorn to scattered acacia in short grass to open savanna. It is not a line, it is a gradient, and every year it moves. The whole way of life along it is built around that movement, with herders taking animals north into the fresh grass during and after the rains and back south again as the ground dries. On routes worked out over centuries and negotiated with the farming communities they pass through. When the rains come late or fail, the whole system compresses southward and pressure builds on land that is already occupied. It is one of the most climatically sensitive inhabited regions on the planet, and everything about the culture there is shaped by the knowledge that the shoreline is not fixed. The 87th fact concerns the practical skill of knowing where you are when there is nothing to look at, which the desert peoples developed to a level that outside observers repeatedly described as uncanny and which is, on inspection, simply very close observation applied for a lifetime. Wind ripples on open sand run perpendicular to the prevailing wind, so a person who knows the season's wind can take a rough bearing from the pattern under their own feet without looking up. The angle of the sun and the length of a shadow give both direction and time. Certain plants indicate a water table within reach. The color and hardness of the ground indicate whether a vehicle or an animal will sink. Bird flight at dusk points toward water because most birds drink before roosting. Dung tells you who came through and roughly when. Distant dust tells you what is moving, and the stars, which is where the fine navigation lives, hold their positions with total reliability, so a night march can be steered by keeping a chosen star in a fixed relation to the body and correcting for its drift across the hours. None of that is mystical. It is all just information that is genuinely there and that most people never learn to see. The 88th fact is one of the odder economic realities of the modern world, which is that the largest pile of sand on the planet is useless for making the thing everyone assumes sand is for. Concrete requires aggregate, and aggregate requires grains that lock together, with angular edges and rough faces that bind into the cement paste. Desert sand is the opposite. Tens of thousands of years of being blown about have rounded and polished every grain until they are little spheres, and spheres roll past one another instead of interlocking, producing a weak mix. So the countries of the Sahara, sitting on an effectively infinite quantity of sand, import sand for construction, or crush rock to make artificial aggregate, or dredge it from riverbeds and coasts. Meanwhile, the world's usable sand, which comes from rivers, lake beds, and shorelines, has become a genuinely scarce and heavily traded resource, extracted in enormous volumes and fought over in several countries. There is something quietly comic about the largest desert on Earth being unable to supply the one commodity it appears to consist of, and something instructive, too, which is that the desert sand is not raw material. It is a finished product, and it took a very long time to make. The 89th fact is that a great deal of what is now known about the Sahara's past was found by instruments looking down rather than by people looking around. Because the sand is dry and radar penetrates dry material, satellites have mapped buried river systems that no surveyor on the ground could ever have traced. Because the desert is bare, high-resolution imagery shows subtle ground marks that would be invisible under vegetation. And archaeologists have identified thousands of previously unrecorded sites from a desk, including field systems, tomb fields, fortified settlements, and long lines of stone structures. In one survey of the Libyan interior, imagery revealed the outlines of dozens of Garamantian towns and villages, complete with walls, cemeteries, and irrigation systems in country that had been assumed to be effectively unoccupied in antiquity. Elsewhere. Satellite work has picked out the shorelines of vanished lakes, has faint concentric pale bands, and old caravan routes has darker lines where centuries of traffic compacted the surface. It is a strange kind of exploration conducted in an office, and it has expanded the known human history of the desert enormously in a couple of decades without anyone getting sand in their boots. The 90th fact is that the desert is one of the world's great preservers, because decay requires water and there is none. Organic material that would rot away within a season in a temperate climate can survive for thousands of years in dry Saharan sand, and the archaeological record reflects it. Wooden objects, basketry, cordage, leather, textiles, seeds, and food remains turned up intact from context where in any other environment there would be nothing but stone and pottery. Bodies buried in dry sand desiccate naturally rather than decomposing, which is very likely the observation that led in the Nile Valley to the whole elaborate practice of deliberate preservation that followed. Paint on rock walls holds its color for thousands of years because there is no rain to wash it and no lichen to grow over it. Even the ground itself keeps records, holding footprints and wheel ruts and campfire scatters for centuries. It is a peculiar sort of generosity from a landscape that is otherwise extremely reluctant to give anybody anything. Nothing survives out there for long, but whatever stops moving out there survives more or less forever. 90. And the end of the list is close enough now that it can be seen from here, which means it is a good time to say that reaching it is not the point and never was. If sleep arrives before the 100th fact, the 100th fact will not mind. It is not much of a fact anyway, as will become apparent. The last 10 go slowly, and they go quiet, and they go inward, because everything left to say is about very small things and very long times. There is a crust on the surface of the gravel plains, a few millimeters thick, made of things too small to see, and it is holding the entire surface of large parts of the desert together, and it takes 40 years to heal a tire track. There is life inside the stones, a couple of millimeters under the outer skin, so slow that a single colony may be older than agriculture, doing almost nothing, extremely patiently, in the dark. There is the brightness of the whole surface bouncing sunlight back out into space and quietly participating in the temperature of a planet. And there is the appointment the desert has already made with its own future, 10 or 15,000 years out, when the wobble comes back around and the rain returns and the lakes refill in the same basins they filled before, because the basins have not gone anywhere and neither have the riverbeds under the sand. And then the last few facts are simply a day. Dawn, and at 20 minutes when every ripple has a shadow. Midday, when the whole desert stops and nothing moves that has a choice. Evening, and at 20 minutes when it all goes the color of a coal fire. And then the middle of the night, cold and clear and utterly silent, which is where this ends, and which is roughly where the listener is now. Let it get slower from here. There is nothing else to do tonight. One last framing before the quiet part, and then it can all be allowed to blur. Everything in the final stretch operates on a time scale that has no relationship to a human day. The crust heals in 40 years. The colony inside the stone has been there since before writing. The varnish on the pebble thickens by an amount too small to name in a human lifetime. The rain returns in 12,000 years, give or take, and it is not going to be early and it is not going to be late, because there is nothing in the mechanism capable of being either. Set against that, everything that happened today, everything that was said and not said, everything left undone, and everything worried about at length, occupies a span so short that the desert has no instrument fine enough to record it. That is not a diminishment. It is a very large and very patient thing, offering to hold the whole of it for you until morning, at no cost and with no further conversation required. Let it. The last 10 facts are small and quiet and go nowhere in particular, which is exactly what they are for. The 91st fact is that a great deal of the desert surface is alive in a way that is easy to walk over without noticing. On the gravel plains and the stable sandy flats there is often a thin, dark crust binding the top few millimeters of ground, made of cyanobacteria, algae, lichens, and mosses growing together into a mat. It looks like nothing, a slightly darker or slightly knobbly texture on the surface, and it is one of the most important structures in the whole system. It holds the soil down and stops it blowing away. It absorbs and retains what little moisture arrives. It fixes nitrogen out of the air and makes it available to any seed that lands there, which is why the higher plants of the desert are so often found growing in and around crust rather than on bare sand. It can survive completely desiccated for years, effectively switched off, and then resume photosynthesis within minutes of being wetted. And it is extraordinarily fragile. A single set of tire tracks across a crusted plain breaks it, and once broken, the exposed soil begins to blow, and the crust may take decades to grow back over the scar, which is why the tracks of vehicles from a war fought 80 years ago are still legible from the air. The 92nd fact is that where even the crust cannot survive, life retreats inside the rock itself. In the driest and most exposed parts of the desert, certain algae, fungi, and bacteria live within the porous spaces of porous stone a couple of millimeters below the surface in a thin colored band that becomes visible if a flake is knocked off. Down there, they are shielded from the worst of the ultraviolet light and from the extremes of the surface temperature, and they receive just enough filtered daylight to photosynthesize and just enough moisture from occasional dew and fog seeping into the stone to keep functioning. Their metabolism is almost unimaginably slow. Growth is measured in fractions of a millimeter over long periods, and individual communities may be many thousands of years old. They are among the most extreme organisms known on this planet, and they are studied closely by people who think about whether anything could ever have lived under the surface of Mars, because the conditions inside a Saharan rock are among the closest analogs available. There is life in the driest ground in the world, in the stones, doing almost nothing, extremely slowly for a very long time. The 93rd fact is that the Sahara is bright enough to influence the whole planet's heat budget. Dark surfaces absorb sunlight and pale surfaces reflect it, and a very large area of pale sand and rock, under a sky with almost no cloud to interrupt the exchange, sends a substantial fraction of the sunlight that lands on it straight back out to space. That reflectivity is a real term in the global energy balance, large enough that climate models must represent it carefully and large enough that changes to it matter. It also drives circulation in its own right. The intense heating of the desert surface creates a persistent low-pressure region and a rising column of hot, dry air over North Africa that helps to organize the West African monsoon, which in turn waters the Sahel and, at a remove, influences weather systems that cross the Atlantic. The desert is not a passive hole in the map where the interesting weather stops. It is one of the engine components sitting in the middle of a hemisphere, hot, bright, and dry, pushing air around and bouncing light back out into the dark. The 94th fact is that the desert has an appointment to keep, and that the date is roughly known. The orbital cycle that dried the Sahara 5,000 years ago has not stopped running, and it will in due course bring northern summers back around to receiving more sunlight, which will pull the monsoon north again, and the desert will green again as it has done many times before. The current best estimates put the next humid period somewhere in the region of 10 to 15,000 years from now, which is impossibly far away from a human point of view and is, on the desert's own clock, roughly the equivalent of next season. When it comes, the lakes will refill in the same basins because the basins have not moved. The rivers will run in the same buried channels because the channels are still there under the sand waiting. Grass will grow on ground that has been bare for the whole of recorded history. It has all happened before, and the machinery is entirely intact. The Sahara, in other words, is not permanent and is not even unusual. It is one half of a very slow oscillation currently in the dry half going about its business. The 95th fact is what all of that does to a sense of time, which is possibly the desert's most useful export. Everything out there operates on a scale that makes ordinary human urgency look faintly absurd. The dune moves 50 feet a year. The varnish on the stones thickens by a few atoms a century. The water beneath the sand fell as rain before farming was invented and has been sitting in the rock ever since, in no hurry. The shrub adds a millimeter in a good year. The star dune has been standing in the same spot since the last ice age was ending. The crust takes 40 years to heal a tire track. The lake will come back in 10,000 years and will not be late. And in the middle of all of that geological patience, a person arrives, stays for a few days, worries about a number of things that will not matter by the following spring, and leaves a set of footprints that will still be there, unaltered, long after the worries have been comprehensively resolved by the simple passage of time. The desert does not offer that lesson. It simply lies there being enormous and slow, and people take the lesson anyway. The 96th fact is about dawn, which is the best hour of the desert day and the shortest. The cold of the night is still lying on the ground, and the air is perfectly still, because the wind has not yet been given a reason to blow. The eastern sky goes pale green, then apricot, then a hard clean gold, and the first direct light comes across the dune field almost horizontally, so that every ripple on every slope throws a shadow as long as a hand, and the whole surface appears carved, textured, and enormously detailed for about 20 minutes. Then the sun climbs, the shadows shorten, the texture flattens out. And by mid-morning, the same dunes are smooth, pale, and almost featureless. In that first hour, the sand is cool enough to walk on barefoot. The night's tracks are all still there, jerboa and beetle and lizard and fox crossing and recrossing, and they will be gone by afternoon. Anything that intends to travel that day is already moving. And anything that intends to survive the day is already thinking about where it will be at noon. The 97th fact is about the middle of the day, which is when the desert stops. By late morning, the ground is throwing heat back upward, and the air above it shimmers, so that the horizon dissolves into a band of liquid silver, and distant hills detach and float. The color drains out of everything. The sky, which was deep blue at 6, goes white at the edges. Nothing moves that has any choice, and the choices are limited to shade, burrow, or altitude. Lizards climb onto the tops of stones to get their bodies out of the boundary layer, or stand alternating 2 feet at a time off the ground in a slow shuffle. Birds sit motionless in whatever thin shadow a thorn bush throws, wings held slightly open, panting. People stop, string up a cloth, lie down under it, and do not do anything at all until the worst of it has gone past. It is not a rest so much as a suspension. Between about 11 and 4, the largest hot desert on Earth is, functionally, closed, and the silence in that period is complete except for the faint, dry, ringing sound that heat seems to make when there is nothing else to hear. The 98th fact is about the evening, and about the 20 minutes when the whole desert turns the color of a coal fire. As the sun drops toward the horizon, the light travels through more atmosphere, loses its blue, and arrives red, and at the same time, the angle lowers again so that the ripples and slip faces regain their shadows. Red light on already reddish sand produces a saturation that photographs never quite manage. The dune crests glow. The shadowed faces go deep violet. Distant rock plateaus turn to silhouette. And then the sun goes, and the heat begins visibly to leave, and the temperature falls fast enough to feel on the skin within minutes. The wind, which usually rises through the afternoon, drops away. There is a short period of blue dusk in which everything is still visible, but nothing has any color. The sand going gray, the sky going deeper, and the first stars arriving one at a time in a sky that is still light enough to seem crowded by them. It is the point in the day when almost everything alive out there begins to move again. The 99th fact is about the middle of the night, at the far end of the cooling, which is when the desert is most itself. By 2 or 3 in the morning, the ground has given up everything it took in during the day. The air is cold, dry, and utterly still. The sky is at its clearest, and the band of the Milky Way stands over the dunes with structure visible in it. And the sand, which has no color at night, reflects enough starlight to be faintly and evenly luminous, so that the landscape reads as a pale surface under a dark one with a horizon line between them and nothing else at all. The tracks of the night's traffic are being laid down all around, mostly unheard. The sand slope makes its small settling noises. Somewhere a stone splits. There is no moisture on anything because there is no moisture anywhere, so nothing drips and nothing rustles. And the total absence of sound is a physical presence rather than an absence which everybody who has slept out there mentions and nobody quite manages to describe. And then, very slowly, the eastern sky loses its blackness at the bottom edge, and the whole thing prepares to begin again. The 100th fact is the simplest one, and it is the reason all the others were worth collecting. None of it requires an audience. The dune moved 50 feet last year, whether or not anybody measured it. The dust lifted off the dead lake bed in Chad and crossed an ocean and fell on a forest, and the forest used it, and neither one was informed. The water beneath the sand has been sitting in the rock since the ice, not waiting for anything, simply present. The oryx walked out into the sand and found the grass that grew after a rain nobody recorded. The star dune held its position for 13,000 years, while everything anybody has ever heard of happened somewhere else. The crust healed a scar slowly. The stone cracked in the cold. The Ouida crossed 1,000 miles of it in a single night, twice a year, for 8 years, and was never once observed doing so. And in 10 or 15,000 years, the rain will come back, and the lakes will fill in the same basins, and the grass will come up over all of it, and that will happen whether or not anyone is around to be pleased about it. That is the whole of the 100th fact. The desert does not need anything from anybody, including attention. And there is a great deal of rest available in that, if it is wanted. And that is the 100. There is nothing after it, and nothing that follows from it, and no reason at all to have kept any of them. They will all still be true tomorrow, whether or not a single one is remembered, which is the most reliable property a fact can have, and the reason these are worth telling in the dark. The counting is over. The lamp is out. It may be worth staying out there for another minute or two, though, before the whole thing is let go, because the desert at this hour is very good company precisely because it is not company at all. So picture it once more, and then let the picture go soft at the edges and stop maintaining it. The sand is cold now. All the heat that stood on it through the afternoon has gone straight up through a clear sky and out, and the surface has contracted very slightly, and somewhere on the shadowed face of a dune a few thousand grains have shifted a fraction of a millimeter against one another and made a small dry sound that nobody heard. A stone on a gravel plain 40 miles away has split with a soft crack after 10,000 days of expanding at noon and shrinking at midnight, and the two halves are lying where they fell, and they will still be lying there in 1,000 years, in the same position with the same faces up. There is a fox somewhere out on the flat with its enormous ears turned forward, standing still, listening to something moving under the sand, and it has not had a drink of water in its entire life and does not expect one. There is a jerboa crossing a dune crest in long, unhurried arcs and leaving two neat prints and a fine drawn line behind it. There is a crust of living things a few millimeters thick holding down the surface of a plain the size of a small country, doing that quietly, having done it for centuries. There is water in the rock 1,000 feet below all of it, cold and still, which fell as rain when there were glaciers over Europe and has not moved much since. And overhead there is the whole band of the galaxy standing across the sky with structure visible in it, throwing down just enough light that the sand has a faint pale glow of its own and the horizon can still be told from the sky. Far above that, several million small birds are crossing in the dark, on their way south, in complete silence, and they will be over the far edge of the desert by morning, and not one of them will be seen. High over the western coast, a plume of dust lifted out of a dead lake bed in Chad is drifting slowly out over the Atlantic, and in about a week, a very small part of it will fall onto a forest on another continent, and the forest will use it, and neither one will know. And in 10 or 15,000 years, when the earth's slow wobble has carried the northern summers back around to where they were, the rain will come north again and stay, and the lakes will fill in the same basins they filled the last time, because the basins have not moved, and grass will come up over the dunes, and the rivers will run again in the channels that are still down there under thee. Sand waiting for them. None of that requires anything from anybody. It is all arranged already, and it is all in progress, and the only thing being asked of anyone tonight is nothing whatsoever. So let it go now. Let the shoulders drop the last inch. Let the breathing find its own rhythm and keep it without help. Let the sand go on cooling somewhere a very long way from here, in the dark, under a great many stars, patiently, for the rest of the night, and then the rest of the year, and then the rest of the age. It will manage perfectly well without being watched. It always has. Rest easy. Let the small sounds of that place carry on at the edge of hearing for as long as they are useful. The faint ticking of the cooling slope, the far-off crack of a stone, the soft, dry movement of grains going down a face in the dark, and then let those go too. Good night, and sleep well.